mostly work it out in your mind, and then get the confirmation, then speak it. So he could be, say, the 3 hour and a half hours that he's not dictating. uh, I believe he's doing spiritual exercises that are sincere,
Such as,
out in the woods praying for guidance, trying to work out the story in his mind, but presenting it as an actual history in this book. But so God is giving him the story. So some people see that as a possibility that he thought it was real. I think it's inspired to write a story that people will believe, that has true doctrine in it. Some people can still see all of this as being inspired
yeah,
and needed at the time. It got the job done. It was a maybe they might see it as a miracle. See, like uh, Brian Hale's approach is to show how difficult it would be to do it naturally. Okay,
yes. And I want to
and
talk about Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's episode. I have with me scholar, historian, Joe Smith biographer, friend, and critic, Dan Vogel. Dan, thanks for joining me.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. So Dan's been on my channel twice before. We've had previous discussions. The first set of interviews we did was about Joe Smith's involvement in folk magic, having a seer stone, engaging in treasure digging, and we touched a little bit on the Book of Mormon translation. And then our most recent episode that we did back in, I think it was like November time, we discussed the witnesses of the gold plates. And Dan gives sort of like his view or his theory on the witnesses, possibly Joe Smith fashioning his own set of metal plates out of tin, and perhaps the three witnesses maybe having a hallucinatory sort of visionary experience. And I think you correct me if you feel I'm wrong here, Dan, but I feel like when we came to the end of that episode, I felt like we came to almost like a bit of a middle point, because as I've looked at the witnesses, if I looked at their first-hand, second-hand statements, I see a lot of credibility in the sense that they seem to sincerely believe they saw the angel, they saw the plate, it was real to them. They reaffirmed it throughout their lives, even after leaving the church. And I think you would agree they're not part of a conspiracy. They're not liars. No. They're sincere.
Yes.
And I think we were discussing, well, was it a real vision or was it a hallucination? And I think the point you made was really it comes down to, is the Book of Mormon historical? Because believers, maybe like myself or apologists, would point to the witnesses as this seems like evidence to support the Book of Mormon. This is a positive case. And I think their statements, their testimonies need to be taken into account. But your position is more, we should really examine, is the Book of Mormon ancient historical or a 19th century text, and then interpret the witnesses depending on that conclusion. Would that be a fair sort of summation of sort of our general consensus on the witnesses? Where we
Well, I'm mostly concerned trying to get the accurate historical account, and I think the published statements are a bit misleading, and they also are unifying statements for an experience that might have been, especially for the 8 witnesses and the 3 witnesses, might have been a little different from each other, but that they could sign these statements because they're worded in a very general way, and they're very ambiguously worded. And but I don't think there's any like conspiracy to deceive or lie or anything like that.
right.
But they wanted to make their statements as simple and straightforward as possible. And I think we make a mistake if we just read it at face value, especially the 8 witnesses, where it sounds like the plates were just naturalistically there. To my reading of early Mormon history, that makes no sense. That the 3 witnesses would see them with the spiritual eyes. The revelation would promise them, you will see them with the spiritual eye, just as my servant Joseph Smith has seen them. And then the 8 witnesses, a few days or weeks later, get to see them in a very naturalistic way. It doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why I've tried to pull out, misreadings of each of these testimonies, like the three witnesses, make it sound like, oh, it doesn't mention Joseph Smith being there. It just mentions we three witnesses. An angel came down and showed us the plates, and it sounds like they're all together. If you
Yeah,
read it that
in
way,
Joseph Smith's history, I believe he talks about how Martin, separated from the other two,
right?
and then he saw
So
the angel on the plates after. Doesn't mean necessarily wasn't. They all still could have claimed to having, the vision of the angel on the plates, but you're saying that
yeah,
it's not exactly the way maybe it's represented in the official testimony.
yeah, and there's a lot left out that we know from, let's say, David Whitmer's later statements, that they also saw the Liahona and brass plates and the sword of Laban,
Right.
things like
Mm-hmm.
that.
That's right.
And that doesn't mention that in there. So if you painted a painting, you would naturally have like the three witnesses together and the angel showing them the plates, only the plates. You wouldn't have like a table behind them or nearby with the other objects on them. You could actually, you couldn't paint the separate, because you kind of want Martin Harris there, right? Because it's more a symbolic thing. But we know that Martin Harris wasn't there. There was just two of them with Joseph Smith.
Sure.
And then Joseph Smith went to Martin Harris, and then Martin Harris had the same vision. At least it was to me, Joseph Smith says.
Well, yeah, that's
So,
it. He can't know for
at least
certain
it was to me. Yeah.
exactly what they saw. But yes,
Yeah.
I'll refer my list to our discussion on the witnesses, because we talked for about 2 hours and 40 minutes, and maybe later on we can maybe touch back on the witnesses. But the topic of today, what we're going to discuss, is Dan's view, or his theory, for how Joseph Smith would have composed and created the Book of Mormon naturalistically, if not, an angel coming with ancient gold plates and Joseph Smith translating by the gift and power of God and being commanded of God. Then what could be a naturalistic explanation for this 588 page text that he orally dictated in around 2 to 3 months time. And I've had the opportunity to interview lots of different faithful scholars. I've interviewed Brant Gardner, Blake Ostler, Stephen Smoot, Dan Peterson, Michael Ash, Brian Hales, talking about various things to do with maybe evidence or arguments for the Book of Mormon, complexity, things in Old World Geography, New World Geography, and also maybe theories of translation. But I think because I'm trying to still be fair and balanced while I am a believer, to want to talk to those of the opposing side as well. I think I remember you made a statement to me that if you're looking for the truth, you should listen to what everybody has to say. So, I've reread Grant Palmer's book. I read your biography, and we'll talk about that more later. Named Davis, and really trying to look at, okay, is there some plausible naturalistic explanations for how he could have done it himself if it's not an ancient text? So that's going to be really part one, is talking about Dan's theory, why Joseph Smith, what were his motivations or purposes for creating it naturalistically, sources or influence that he might have been drawing upon, and then Dan giving sort of his final summary of why he sees it as a 19th century text. And then we've also planned to do a part two, where Dan has agreed to respond to maybe some of the strongest apologetic arguments or evidence that faithful scholars would point to. I believe as well, you alluded to me that you're planning to do a series on the Book of Mormon on your channel.
Yes, I'm
looking to dive.
Trying to spend a block of time, maybe a year, producing videos just on these historicity issues with the Book of Mormon. So
right,
I plan on learning some things.
Yeah, and
while I'm doing it, that's why
I've been doing a big series on the Book of Mormon. I thought it was only going to take me 3 months, and it's ended up being like 9 months, and I've loved it. There's a lot to it. And I'd be more than welcome for you to use some of my interviews, my own episodes, you can use some of that to engage with or respond to. So you're actually going to be diving deeper as well. So your responses may not be exactly how maybe you'll feel after you do the deeper dive. Who knows? Maybe you'll be converted and become an apologist. You never know. Wouldn't that be great? We're going to be promoting Dan's book, Joe Smith, The Making of a Prophet, where a lot of what we'll be discussing, you can read in there in more depth. And also his YouTube channel, Dan Vogel, as well. And look out for the upcoming videos on the Book of Mormon. And tell us a little about your latest book, maybe just in a minute or less, Charisma Under Pressure. I've not had the opportunity to read it yet, but I would like to read it. In a nutshell, what is that book about?
Charisma Under Pressure. Yeah.
Lovely.
The latest contribution. This is the middle years of Joseph Smith's life, from 1831 to 1839. his life in Ohio and Missouri. And it goes with two other volumes that were published probably 10 years ago altogether. The first volume by Signature Books and Smith Pettit Foundation. The first one was Natural Born Seer by Richard Van Wagoner, on that covered the first part of his life, up to 1831. And then Martha Bradley Evans, Glorious in Persecution, and it's Joseph Smith's life in Nauvoo, the last 4 years.
Okay, so that's gonna be your. Are you gonna do another book on Nauvoo then after as well?
Yes, I might.
That'll be interesting.
How can I not?
Of course.
So that makes my own trilogy, of Joseph Smith's life, of my complete thoughts about Joseph Smith. So yeah, it's kind of on the back burner kind of a thing while I do other stuff. The front burner is the Book of Mormon. So
and do you mind if I
my
ask
YouTube channel
briefly what prompted you to want to do a deeper series into the Book of Mormon? Because have you not covered the Book of Mormon in some episodes on your channel, or is it because maybe recent
well, I have
apologetic arguments?
Yeah, well, I have I focused more on what I've published before, because it's real easy to convert that into a video, right?
Yeah,
like
you'll have to read
the mound builders, ancient ruins, and the mound builder, I forget the name of I made 3 videos.
Okay.
But it's based on my first book I ever published, which was the what is it? I forget the
It's bad if you don't remember the name.
I forget the title. Okay. Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon. From
Okay,
Columbus to Joseph Smith. So, and it's basically about theories of the Indian origins, because that presented a theological conundrum. Like how did they get here? Are they related to Adam? That was a big issue when they discovered America and that there were people in it. That discovering a whole continent that they didn't know about, and then discovering there's people in it. How does that fit with our theology? And so that created a huge.
And that will tie in later when we talk about the mound builder myth, and was that potentially an influence for the Book of Mormon as well. But I think that's exciting that you're going to be doing series diving in deeper. And for listeners who are watching this, I want to make this clear: this episode will not be me arguing or debating with Dan. While I am a believer and may come to a different conclusion, I want to try to let Dan lay out sort of his explanation, his theory for how it could have been done. And then, maybe just interject with the odd questioner. The apologist might say this, but it's to see if there's a good explanation, we should be open to hear it, if we want to be balanced. So I think a good place to start is talking about your view. Actually, no, I want to ask you this question before we talk about the Book of Mormon, because we didn't talk about this in the previous interview, and I don't know if you mentioned it in the book. So Joseph Smith talks about the angel Moroni visiting him in 1823. We won't get into Moroni or Nephi from some early accounts, but an angel comes in 1823 that God has a work for him to do to translate an ancient text, and Joseph talks about going to the hill multiple times in 1827, obtaining the plates. You believe Joseph Smith is a pious fraud. So you believe that he's sincere, that he sincerely believes he's inspired, and you believe he had a born again experience. I'm curious, what is your take? I think the born again experience is with regards to his first vision. You think it was more of a born again experience. I'm curious, with regards to the angel, so he would have been 17. Do you believe that he might have had some sort of, maybe a dream of some sort that prompted the angel and the gold plates story? Or do you think it came more from the treasure digging guardian spirit lore? Do you have any thoughts? If not, if it didn't really happen, what do you think might have came from?
Well, so I don't think he had any plates. So why? And if he didn't have any plates, there were no historical Nephites. And if there were no historical Nephites, a Nephite didn't appear to him as an angel. Is a later term applied to the messenger, as Lucy Smith said, that appeared to him. It was the treasure guardian spirit was the way they saw it. Now, what if he actually saw something or whatever? It's not necessarily necessary to decide that, but I don't believe he did. I believe it was a conscious decision, a very difficult conscious decision he made uh, to introduce this story. But he was telling lots of treasure digging stories. This is just one other treasure digging story that was far more elaborate and had a treasure, a book written on gold, hidden in a hill, and he was using that as a background story about, for talking about what the book said and
Okay.
about the ancient inhabitants. And just like later he reads the parchment of John in Palestine, he sees it in a stone and it's nowhere near him, and he reads from it. Well, that's what he's doing. The book is in the hill, and he's telling stories from the book that's in the hill through his seer stone to his family, and probably to solve their religious questions. The family hadn't split up in 1823. The family doesn't religiously split until after Alvin's death in 1823, and
Okay, that
Lucy
was going to
joins
be
a
my next
Presbyterian
question.
church.
Was going to be, if not Joe Smith being commanded and translated by the gift and power of God, an ancient, record written by, ancient inhabitants in the Americas, what were his motivations or purposes for then wanting to create the book? So you're just touching on that then to resolve maybe some of his disputes or religious differences. So tell us what you think some of his motivations or purposes, and when you think the idea first came to create a book like the Book of Mormon.
Well, I think he started off small and just with his family. He wasn't thinking in 1823 of starting a new church. That all evolved later, even actually as he was translating the Book of Mormon or dictating the Book of Mormon. It evolves within that project. It evolves into an idea of organizing a group of true believers in Christ.
You see that after when Jesus comes and visits the Nephites, because later on it talks a little bit more specifically about establishing the church, sacrament prayers, those sorts of things. Is that where you hypothesize the idea might have come from?
Yeah, more or less. That I can't say when exactly he gets the idea,
Sure, yeah.
but when it shows, the idea shows up. Remember, he had lost 116 pages in 1828, and then in 1829 he finally gets a permanent scribe, Oliver Cowdery, in April of 1829. The month before that, Martin Harris shows up, and this is after a trial. His wife had sued for Martin Harris's participation in the Book of Mormon project and losing money. And during that, somebody said, "Oh, Joe Smith told me the box contained nothing but sand." And so Martin Harris took off and he went back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to ask for a greater witness that Joe Smith has the plates. So, according to Isaac Hale,
I think at this point he had been the scribe for the 116 pages, but
yeah,
the three
and he's
witnesses
still
their visionary experience yet.
Yeah. So, and he's always trying to prove it to his wife, right? He takes the 116 pages just to prove to his wife that he's not wasting his time. Okay. So, and then he loses the manuscript. And then, there's this trial that Lucy Smith talks about. And she talks about during this trial, Lucy Smith is the instigator of it, that several people testified against the Book of Mormon, and one witness, and it might have been Peter Ingersoll actually, said that Joe Smith told me there was nothing but sand in this box, and it's a total fraud. And so that Martin Harris wants a greater witness that Joe Smith has the plates, and he asked Joe Smith, and Joe Smith gets a revelation, and it's now DNC 5. Okay,
yes, remember that one.
But the way it reads now is changed a version. Okay, the Book of Commandments has the earlier wording, which
Right.
I'm going to refer to, which is so. According to Isaac Hale, Joseph Smith says, "Okay, follow my feet prints in the snow, and you'll see it." And Harris followed and didn't see it though. Okay, so then the revelation comes, and it says that he should stop translating after he translates a few more pages.
Right. I think I remember that from
You
DNC
remember
5.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's translating bits and pieces, and I think it's just in the beginning of what we have as Mosiah, because he's lost 116 pages, and he kept probably a signature that was only partially filled, and Harris took the rest. And so that's why Mosiah begins abruptly now. Okay. So he's doing a few more things like King Benjamin's speech,
Hmm.
and then King Benjamin stops, and then all of a sudden King Benjamin starts talking again. And so Harris may have been a scribe for that second part of King Benjamin's speech, because it mentions if you borrow something from a neighbor, you must return it, or else you cause your neighbor to sin also. And I'm thinking, well, isn't that a message to Martin Harris if you ever heard it? And so I
Did
think
you know from
that's
the original manuscript, from determining which scribes wrote which parts?
we
Uh,
don't have that portion.
we don't. Okay, we don't have that part.
That
So
would be great if we did. I would love to see
I
that.
think it's Mosiah 4, I believe, is where it talks about that at the end of his speech. And so
Yeah,
you
and so
have the message to
you,
Martin if Joseph is the one authoring it.
the first edition, what we have as the first three chapters is chapter 1 in the first edition, and then chapter 4 in ours is where chapter 2 starts. So
I
when
see.
you read it, King Benjamin is talking, and he says stuff that even that would have appealed to Emma Smith, which is an infant dies in infancy without baptism, kind of is saved by, the atonement of Jesus, even the same as non-believers. So that would have been a comforting thing for Emma, who had just lost a child. If she were the scribe, it would be a beautiful thing to say. And so I believe that, and then King Benjamin stops and says, "Amen," and he stops. And then all of a sudden he starts talking again, and includes this part about the wealthy shall impart of their wealth. That's Martin Harris, I believe.
Okay.
And returning what you have what you borrow, unless you cause your neighbor to sin also. Well,
Mhm.
how does that happen? In the Book of Mormon, it fits with the manuscript it perfectly, I think. So that's how I see how that occurred. So he was in the very beginnings of Mosiah, when few more pages were translated at the
Okay.
time of this revelation, DNC 5. And DNC 5 also has statements in it that were removed or changed. And it said, Joseph Smith should pretend to no other gift
That's right.
besides translation. And then later, because that sounds pretty final, because my argument is at this point, that's all he has in mind, translating the Book of Mormon. He isn't seeing becoming a founder of a religion and president of the high priesthood and president of the church, and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't see. So then when they edited it in 1835, they added until the Book of Mormon's finished. That
Right. Okay.
opened the door to what other things that happened that we know happened later. And then there was another passage to talk about if this generation harden not their hearts, the Lord will work a reformation among the people and put down all their lyings, deceivings, and whatnot.
Was this in the
And
Book of Commandments or in Doctrine and Covenants?
the Book of Commandments.
Okay.
This is the 1833 version. I think that's the earliest version we have.
Yes.
So the Reformation, I believe the Book of Mormon was to put down false doctrine and cause the religious world to repent and reform and get rid of all those commandments of men and things like that. And
I think the book talks about, I have no idea what verse this is, but I remember reading this in the Book of Mormon where it talks about how the Book of Mormon and the Bible would come together to confound, false doctrines and to, testify of each other. So you think that that would have been a motivation to clarify and to, speak against sort of false doctrines of man that he was seeing.
yeah, that was part of the goal. Things really changed later. Well, at first their authority made them different than all the other churches, and the authority was based on charisma, on having the gifts of the Spirit, restoring the gifts of the Spirit. And the other religions, all they had was the form of godliness, but denied the power thereof. That's out of Isaiah, right? And that's what Parley P. Pratt said was, Campbellism had the form of godliness, but it didn't have the power. And that's why Sidney Rigdon and his congregation were separating from Campbellism at the time the Book of Mormon shows up, is they were looking for a restoration of the spirit,
The gifts.
not just the form. Okay. So the gifts, especially tongues, because the Book of Mormon has passages about coming up out of the waters of baptism and speaking with the tongues of angels.
Mm-hmm.
And which was later identified as the Adamic language. And so that's what a lot of the early converts were looking for. They wanted to come up out of the waters and speak in tongues, and they did in northern Ohio. And then it got a little carried away and out of hand, and Joseph Smith had to rein that in a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
I remember reading about that.
Yeah.
So getting back to the question about his motive, their purposes. I don't know if you're circling back to that. What would you say in 1823 so you're saying that there might have been things happening around the time that might have been influencing what was in the text naturalistically, but sort of like, what do you think was his initial motivations for like why create this long book? Do you think he had it in his mind how long it was going to be? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, he had no idea of writing a book. He was just probably content with quoting it out of the hill, and his parents already believed that the religions were false. Both of them were united on that. Lucy hadn't joined the Presbyterian Church yet. That wouldn't be until 1824 or 25.
After Alvin's death.
Yeah, after Alvin's death. During the revival that did hit Palmyra and did start with the Methodists, with George Lane, who's my ancestor. And yeah, so George Lane. And it started just like Joseph Smith described, and it divided the family. It wasn't the different religionists debating each other and losing the spirit because they're all debating and contending one with another. It was happening in his own house between his parents. Joseph Smith Sr. wouldn't join, and Lucy wanted to have the whole family united, and the family wouldn't budge. The senior Smith didn't budge. He was mad at Reverend Stockton, the Presbyterian minister who preached at Alvin's funeral, and implied, according to William Smith, very strongly that Alvin had gone to hell because he hadn't been baptized. So the Smiths didn't raise their kids to join churches. They didn't baptize their children in any of the religions because they believed that all of them were corrupt anyway. But Lucy broke, the compact in a way by joining the Presbyterian Church because Alvin's death drove her there, and she needed comfort and to be connected in a religious setting. And Joseph Smith Sr. said, he was angry at the Reverend Stockton, and he was not happy that Lucy joined the very church of that guy, So the Smith family were divided on religion, and I believe that's depicted in the Lehi family, and Lehi represents Joseph Smith Sr. and Nephi Joseph Smith Jr. and Sariah murmurs against Lehi.
Oh,
He's a
so you would make
visionary man. He's a visionary man.
visionary man, right? Because
Yeah.
I claimed visions or dreams, and Drew Smith Sr. claimed to have some dreams. So we'll maybe talk about that, his specific dream for maybe an influence later on. But
Yeah.
you're saying that there's maybe some similarities there between Nephi and Lehi and Drew Smith, his own father. And I believe his father was a Universalist. That's correct.
Right. And so in Lehi's dream, the whole Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream, excuse me, the whole family in his dream make it to the tree. There's nobody's lost because he's a Universalist. Okay.
So he believes everyone saved.
Yeah. And so in the Book of Mormon, not everybody makes it to the tree. And Nephi ends up having the same vision and correcting his father's vision, even saying Lehi was so caught up in his vision that he didn't notice the filthy water, that the river was filthy and the fountain was filthy and the people were drowning in the depths of hell.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a correction of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream.
Okay. So, right. So you see him correcting it by adding in that not all of them made it to the tree, and that some people were in the waters, like in the depths of hell, which have been in Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream.
And so Joseph Smith Sr. is a Universalist. And that's the deal. People who were Universalists recognized the Universalism, anti-Universalism. Later, there's a whole sect called the Nehors who are Universalists. And Joseph Smith uses that to argue against some of the key scriptures against universalism that anti-universalists used in Joseph Smith's day. Like, what about the sin against the Holy Ghost that shall not be forgiven in this world nor the world to come? So we have Alma quoting that before it's even written in the New Testament. He's quoting this key proof text against universalism that other universalists read the Book of Mormon, converted out of universalism. Joseph Smith Sr., Martin Harris, this Smith family story goes that Asel Smith, the grandfather, actually was converted out of his universalism due to reading the Book of Mormon.
Because the Book of Mormon, it's you could say an anti-universalist book. It's very much heaven or hell, very much in the afterlife, and there's some warnings in there about like not like procrastinating the day of repentance, or lying a little or sinning a little and think, oh, you'll only be beaten with a few stripes, and then
well, that was the biggest fear, was if you believe in universalism, sure, you get this all-loving God image out of universalism. God loves all of his children equally, but at the same time you get people who don't have any motivation to obey the commandments of God, so, and that's where you get finally Joseph Smith. In 1830, he dictates Doctrine and Covenants section 19 to Martin Harris, and it talks about that even though the scriptures, which would include the Book of Mormon, talk about eternal damnation, it's not really eternal damnation in duration. Eternal is a synonym for God's name. So it's like God's punishment, God's damnation, instead of actual eternal. So, and the only thing Joseph Smith could give at that time to motivate people to obey the commandment, if there's this secret universalism, in his private life, right? The Revelation says it uses this harsh language to entice people to obey the commandments so that they won't perish. So it's not it says to keep this revelation secret, not to let it be known. And some of the revelations some early Mormons believe that revelations like that should not be published. I mean, because it said not to publish it. That's what David Whitmer thought. It says right in the Revelation not to publish it. Here you are publishing it. Well, the reason why he's publishing it is because in 1832 he has 3 degrees of glory vision, and so even though everyone is basically saved, it's a universalist type revelation. There's still motivation to obey the commandments to get to the highest part.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's how he resolves that. And he probably feels it's okay to publish, and he can harmonize it with this later revelation.
Okay. So in 1823, I believe Lucy Mack Smith in her autobiography, she talks about that Joe Smith is, telling stories to his family members. Now, to an apologist believer might say that he is recounting his interactions with Moroni, maybe visions he's having of the ancient Nephites or Lamanites. But maybe to a naturalist, non-believer, or critic, would you interpret her recollecting that he's telling these stories about the ancient inhabitants of this continent? Can't remember the exact quote, but it's the animals
Yeah,
they're riding on, their
yeah.
warfare, agriculture,
Mhm.
buildings they have. Would you interpret that, if not Joseph recollecting or sharing with his family the visions that he's having, that this is him maybe practicing some of the stories of the Native Americans, and that might have been almost like preparation before the Book of Mormon? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I'm not sure in 1823 he has an idea of actually ever getting these plates, okay, and translating it and publishing it. So in a stone, he would see various objects hidden in the hills, and one of them was a golden throne that this Indian king sat on. It was in this what is known as Miner's Hill, a couple of hills over from the Smith farm. And Joseph Smith Sr. dug a tunnel in the side of that looking for this throne. And and this was before Alvin died, probably, or it had to be before 1825 at the most. Um, so he saw objects. Well, one of them's just a golden book that has writing. And the writing, I imagine his view of what was the content of this book was not anything like what turns out in like first and second Nephi, because that's at the very end of the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
If you go from Mosiah, okay, the lost 116 pages was written much like Mosiah. It wasn't preaching, it wasn't sermons, it was religious story, sort of like Pilgrim's Progress. It was a story about a religious family, and the religion was just incidental to the story, you know. So, and that's what the Book of Mormon tells you, is that Mormons using these records to write stories, and in Mormon does it year by year, and he then turns some of these stories into an opportunity to do religious commentary,
Yes.
and to preach a principle. And that's how the 116 pages probably went.
Because there's a lot of, at the end of certain chapters or certain accounts, there's this commentary of, and thus we see, dot, dot, dot.
Yeah. It would be like if a Puritan wrote a story like that, where they would just use providences of God to teach a principle, or to warn the people, the other Puritans, to repent, because these are signs. Actually, Increase Mather, who was one of the leaders, religious leaders, his son Cotton Mather, they were religious leaders in the Puritan community in New England, and they had a project of collecting all the providential circumstances that they saw. They would see, Indian uprisings as a sign of God's displeasure, a church being hit by lightning over here, that'd be another sign, the smallpox epidemic, wars, or other kinds of things going on. And they used these to write a history. They were collecting these, and they were making a history, sort of like what Mormon was doing, and warning New England to repent before it's too late. They um, this genre of literature, preaching from the pulpit warnings, is known among literary critics as a Jeremiad, because it's like Jeremiah warning Jerusalem. which is what the Book of Mormon talks about. But so these Jeremiahs were preached from the pulpit, and they would use the mound builder myth. The mound, see those people in those mounds? They're all destroyed by the ancestors of the Native Americans. Well, that's what's going to happen to us. If we're not careful, if we don't, guard ourselves against the Indians, but also keep all the commandments of God so that we're worthy to have his protection.
Right.
So, and they would preach that. That's how they would preach it. And that's all in the Book of Mormon. That's exactly what the Book of Mormon does. So,
like if you keep the, you'll be blessed and prosper in the land.
Yep. And it was cyclical. They had this cyclical, of becoming proud and wearing costly apparel is the Puritans were against costly apparel, or,
right.
Even the Quakers went so far as you can't even have a button on your clothes because it's too ornamental, And so yeah, they would preach against wealth and Puritans didn't like they didn't like capitalism, put it that way. They didn't want to make a profit off your brother was a sin. Okay. So they didn't like that when the merchants started taking over the early colonies, in New England and their children. And then they invented a thing called the halfway covenant. And that's a whole another thing. So Joe Smith was a lot of similarities between what Joe Smith did with these covenants, becoming a covenant community. There's a lot to be said about all of that history too, which we won't go into. But
okay.
So so I think Joe Smith was doing that in his talks with his family. The family hadn't, like I said, it hadn't split up or anything. It was just confirming a lot of what they already believed. And Joseph Smith's version, I think the 1832 version isn't anything that either parent would have had a problem with, And in his 1820 religious experience, whatever it was, I argue that it was probably a born-again experience, that it was developed into a vision for a reason, why he had to see Jesus, and then became the Father and Son. And then and the message had changed too, in 1838 to be more fitting for a founder of a religion. It was more of a prophetic call than the 1832 account. 1832 account is more personal salvation and forgiveness of sins. And the 1838 account is very strongly condemning of the other churches and setting Joseph Smith up for his mission to restore the true church. So I believe it was a born-again experience where Joseph Smith was converted to Jesus. That right. His father wasn't. His father was a Universalist, and Universalists, by and large, were also Unitarians who didn't believe in Jesus's divinity, that Jesus was the Son of God, the same as anyone is the Son of God. You become the Son of God when the Spirit comes upon you, and you're born again, and you become a son of God, and just like anyone else. So there's only one God to the Unitarians, and Jesus was just a son. And so Joe Smith was converted to Jesus and tried to convert his father, couldn't get his attention that way. And that's why I believe the Book of Mormon is so Christ-centered.
Okay.
That's the message.
So you believe that he was sincere believer, he had a born-again experience, he was converted to Jesus and the message of the book, because Jesus Christ is filled throughout the Book of Mormon. And
that's the purpose, it says right in the title page.
Yeah, for people to repent and come unto Christ. And you would see it as there's anti-universalist themes as well. So you think he's trying to resolve some of the religious disputes or differences in his family? Well,
they weren't at odds yet in 1823, but he was telling them stories that they could relate to and confirmed their beliefs. So as time goes on, the book kind of changes as he grows and changes. And so my reconstruction is that he goes to the hill, he has seen the plates, he talks about the plates afterwards, Alvin dies. Then he goes to the hill in 1824, and he comes back and says, during the equinox period, close to the equinox, and he tells his father that he couldn't get the plates, and because he couldn't take Alvin, and he was instructed to take Alvin. And I don't believe he mentioned this beforehand either. He just told them that when he came home without the plates. And Joseph Sr., has a hard time accepting that. But I think that was the end. He didn't get the plates. It was over. And I don't think he went every year in 1826, 1825, 1826. The plates were there.
No historical sort of record, anyone writing about him going every year? Because we just have in his history saying that he went every year for years, but you're saying that no one else wrote about it.
So I believe that was it. The spirit had tricked him, and he couldn't get the plates, but he knew the plates were there, and he showed Samuel Lawrence, a fellow seer in Manchester, where the plates were, which was on the eastern side, not the western side, like where we point to now. He was on the eastern side, like every other dig that he had was on the eastern side of these hills. Okay, so he showed Samuel Lawrence in 1825, probably, where they were, to get a second witness, because I also argue that Joseph Smith was involved with the revival of 1824-25. And when he got rejected by the religionists, he went back to his money digging ways. He had repented and given the stone back to Willard Chase. Okay.
So what year was that?
1825.
Okay.
This is the same year Joseph Smith Sr., probably somewhere around there, digging in the side of that other hill called Miners Hill.
Okay.
So he gave the stone back, and then he had Hiram go and borrow it again. And that's how he gets it again, just before he goes with Josiah Stowel down to Harmony, Pennsylvania. So he gets the stone back just in time for that. In October 1825 is when Joseph Smith meets Josiah Stowel. So he gave the stone up.
Months when he's down there in Harmony, Pennsylvania, he boards with Isaac Hale.
Yes.
He's there over the winter time, isn't he? And then doesn't the Glasslicker trial or the hearing, is that like March of 1826?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's hard to keep all this chronology.
It is, yeah.
Very important to keep things in order. Anyway, so he gave up the stone, participated in the revivals. He was inclined to Methodism, but didn't quite want to join, and probably because his parents are divided and he didn't want to choose sides. It would be too much of an emotional price to pay. Okay. So he tries to keep neutral. And so after, and he got rejected, he said, by the religionists. I believe it was at this time and not 1820 that it was clear to him that he didn't fit in there either. And so he borrows the stone back. He starts money digging again. He gets a reputation, and Josiah Stowell probably heard about Joseph Smith through his son, Simpson Stowell, who lived in Manchester. And Simpson probably wrote Josiah about, hey, you're looking for that treasure. I know somebody has this gift. You should meet him, And that's probably why Josiah Stowell showed up there. And Joseph Smith convinced him with a little exhibition of his gift by describing his outhouses and houses and a painted hand.
Yes.
Or a hand on a tree. I think it's
I remember that.
Painted hand on a tree. It's so common thing. But so Joseph Smith goes down there and does all that. Well, so he doesn't go to the hill every year. That's a later addition to his story in order to create a continuity or continuity, actually.
Unusually. Okay.
To the connecting the
Do you know what
1823
date? Sorry,
24 with the 1827.
sorry. Do you know what date in 1825 he goes to Harmony, Pennsylvania? Would that have been after? Because it was September, what, 23rd?
No, so they signed the money digging agreement, remember, between 11 parties,
Yes.
including he and his father, in November of 1825.
Gotcha.
And Justman says that, something like a month, it went on, and before he decided to tell Josiah Stowel it was no use. Well, according to Isaac Hale, he said that the enchantment was so strong that he couldn't see it anymore.
Mm.
And what happened, according to local accounts, is that the money slipped down the hill. They started digging, the money slipped down the hill. They went dug there, and then Justman said he sees the treasure. It slipped down the hill again. There's about 3 holes that were there at one time. There was a really large hole, which is probably the hole they were digging when there was a lady, seeress, before Joseph Smith came on the scene with his stone.
Working for Josiah Stowell on the silver mine?
Yes, yeah. There was a lady.
I don't
I'm trying to
remember
remember the name. It was just one name anyway, and they finally disbanded it. And then he heard about Joseph Smith, and he grabbed Joseph Smith. It was all the previous summer they were digging, and it was a big, like 30-foot diameter hole, and none of it shows up there anymore. They filled it all in because the cows kept falling into these holes. But there is a picture by Anderson, George E. Anderson, around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. No, probably 1910. And he went, and there's a picture of a man standing in one of the smaller holes in a clump of bushes. And the caption on the photograph in the church archives says, "Mormon money hole." So I couldn't find him, but it was overgrown so much. At the time that that the photos were taken, it was all cleared, and you could stand on the hill and see the Joseph Smith home before it burnt down. You can see from the hill where Joseph Smith lived later when he came back with Emma. They moved there, and they went to this house where the Book of Mormon was dictated in the upper story of this house. You can see that house from the hill. I mean, it's that close.
Because the beginning of the Book of Mormon dictation was that down in Harmony, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And then it was due to persecution, they moved then to the Whitmer's property, I believe.
Yeah.
That's where the majority of it was dictated, the between April to June 1829, the 588 pages. Was that all done at the Whitmer's property, or majority of it?
No, so Joseph Smith started dictating the Book of Mormon on the 7th of April, 1829.
Right, yes.
Which is the month that Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as president, the new president. So he started dictating, and they dictated it till the end of May, about. And it seems like he got to the end of the whole, from Mosiah to the Book of Moroni. That's what it appears. That's what it seems like anyway. We don't have all the details nailed down like that, but we're pretty sure he then went in the beginning of June. He and Overcowdery went with David Whitmer, who came down with his wagon. It was like a 2.5-day trip from Fayette to Harmony, and picked them up, and then they went back to Fayette. And so it seems like the month of June, is when Joseph Smith dictated from First Nephi to the Words of Mormon
Okay. So I was at the end
in
of the
one
oral.
month.
They came
Yeah,
back and did that at the end. And that was
right.
the small plates of Nephi.
So Joseph Smith, my reconstruction is that he was hoping that the manuscript would still show up. You know, that's why Mosiah, at the beginning of Mosiah, he tells Martin Harris, to return what he's borrowed. He's hoping. And like the preface of the first edition of the Book of Mormon says, they exerted strenuous efforts to retrieve the manuscript again, and he was hoping that it would still show up. That's why he didn't like start over right away. He just kept on going with this hope, and when it became clear that it wasn't going to show up, all of a sudden you have Mormon introducing himself as the editor. All this time you don't know who's the editor, right? And then in Third Nephi, I think it's somewhere around chapter 5, Mormon introduces himself as a pure Nephite. He introduces himself twice, kind of. But
Okay, so it's on Third Nephi that you see Mormon introducing himself as the
yeah,
one.
I'm the editor, and I was
Right.
named after where Alma baptized all these people.
Oh, the Waters of Mormon.
The Waters of Mormon. Yeah, he
Okay.
was named after that, and he says he's a pure descendant of Nephi, of course, because there's the Mulekites, right? So he's a pure descendant of Nephi, and so this is where I say Joseph Smith has resigned himself to having to restore the first part. So in May 1829, and this is probably around in May that Joseph Smith is introduced, or Mormon's introducing himself, probably in May, the last part, when they're getting ready to leave. They have actually, Oliver Cowdery is actually corresponding with David Whitmer a couple of letters, and that's where the offer is made, by the Whitmer family to host Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and they take them up on that offer because they're having difficulty.
Oliver Cowdery, right? Or no, he was there. He was just a friend, David Whitmer, with Oliver Cowdery. They're just friends.
Oliver Cowdery is the one that introduced Joseph Smith to the Whitmer family.
Right. Did Oliver? Didn't he marry one of the Whitmer girls?
Yes,
Elizabeth.
Anne.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Elizabeth Ann Whitmer.
Gotcha. Okay.
He married her. So Oliver Cowdery is writing back to David Whitmer because David Whitmer was interested what he would find, in Harmony and how it was going. And so they kept a correspondence, and then the offer was made and they accepted. And so they're being brought up. But the plans of David Whitmer coming down are already made, probably when he's introducing Mormon, or in towards the end of his dictation in Harmony, and he's preparing to move. And in May, he gets a revelation, which is now Doctrine and Covenants section 10. This is the section that talks about not retranslating the same over again, that there are actually two sets of plates of Nephi, right?
Right. I think I remember that section.
Yeah. So, and this is May, and this is the date that the Book of Commandments gives. The Joseph Smith Papers, people try to date it later than May or earlier. I forget which, but they don't have it because somebody fudged on the dating at one point.
Okay.
But it's long and involved story of the actual dating and timing, and even in the history of the church gives some clues as to the date. So the date is May, towards the end, and that's where he dictates the solution, how he's going to replace the beginning. And it says there's more parts of my gospel in the small plates, these other plates of Nephi, the small plates. And so the Book of Mormon states itself that it was originally a mixture of the secular and religious history, that they were being kept on the same plates.
Mm-hmm.
because the small plates ran out. Just, so there's these.
So small plates is more specifically a spiritual history, more
Yeah,
devoted
so
to like spiritual matters.
yeah, right.
Kind of
The
like a
more part
spiritual
of the
journal,
gospel.
a general journal that has maybe more of like, secular history and things.
So Joseph Smith, in his solution, sets up two sets of plates, and one is longer, which is the secular, and shorter for the religious, and kept by the prophets, and the large plates are kept by the kings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And judges or whoever.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So when the history is being kept, it's being the religious part, the first Nephi, second Nephi, third Nephi kings, right? Remember, they're all named after Nephi. They are keeping the record on the small plates, and so all the religious stuff is over there, and the large plates are kept by the kings, who is Nephi, so it's the same person, but for a while until it splits off. But
then after Mosiah, they
yeah.
have judges among the
Right.
Nephites. So so the judges then have the large plates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the plates happen to end the small plates, and then they are forced to keep their religious history on to the large plates, and right where the 116 pages are lost, and so Mormon writes his abridgment, and when he writes his abridgment between the small plates and the large plates, he found these small plates among the records he didn't know was there until right then, and somehow Mormon knows exactly the abrupt part that Harris would lose. So like I said before, Joseph Smith probably kept the signature, which is like 16 pages, 8 pages folded in half, making 16 pages. Like, those are like signatures, like a book has a whole bunch of signatures and they're sewn all together. Well,
Mm-hmm.
they kept them in these little booklets. There wasn't individual pages. So Martin Harris probably just grabbed what was translated in the little bit probably that slopped over onto the next signature, or gathering, as some people call it. He took off with those, and there was still an abrupt beginning. Mosiah to this day does not have a superscription at the beginning of that book. It just begins abruptly. All
Right.
the other
Okay.
books have signatures, like little superscriptions that describe
Describing
what's
like,
coming.
okay, is
What's
that sort of like
coming?
at the start of First Nephi, like the
Yeah,
mini paragraph at the top?
right.
Davis
Yeah,
would say sort of like the laying down of the head, or basically the rough outline for the book.
yeah,
Then
right.
Mosiah doesn't have that; it just sort of goes straight into
Doesn't have anything.
Okay.
So, and Alma has some, like it has one at the beginning, and every now and then when it starts a new record or a new episode, it will have a really short superscription. A lot of modern readers do not know that that's part of the original in the manuscript,
Yes.
in the first edition, because we have so many. We put superscriptions on every single chapter,
Right. Yes,
and
they weren't in the manuscript, but
right, and the
the one
chapters weren't
each book.
there.
Right. Yeah.
There were larger chapters, and Orson Pratt made them in the shorter chapters, and so a lot of people don't know these little superscriptions are there in Alma, especially because they're in the middle of the book, and
Is
they
that like
and you
before it starts talks about maybe like the war chapters, or like when Ammon and his brethren go to preach, to the Lamanites? Maybe there's a little one there as well.
it's like Alma chapter 5, I think, is the first one that shows up, but right in the middle. Okay, let's see. Alma 5. Yeah, here we go. So does it show up? Can you see that?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like 2.5 lines there.
Yeah,
Okay, got
that is an original.
right.
It's right
Okay,
in the middle of the book. And
that wasn't inserted in later. That was dictated by Joseph Smith, either supposedly on the gold, but it's coming from the dictation.
Yeah, and there's about 21 of those altogether in the Book of Mormon. So he kind of knows somewhat what's coming.
Right. I was going to ask you that. Well, maybe we could talk briefly about mechanics, your view of the mechanics of the translation, or maybe dictation, we better, in your view. And then we could talk about maybe some of the sources or influences. So would you...
Let me finish this idea first.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the idea is that Mormon knows that little part isn't there. So when you read the words of Mormon, the first part of that bridges the two records, but the last 13 verses of that words of Mormon is an attempt to supply the missing part of the story
for the beginning of Mosiah,
where the beginning of Mosiah starts, because it wouldn't make sense because it starts abruptly, right? And these 13 verses are to fill in what the part that was lost that made sense of the part that came after. So for some reason, not only does Mormon just coincidentally make a bridge between these two records, find the records, and the religious part comes off of these small plates, and he doesn't find those until he's nearly finished. He supplies the part that was missing for the abrupt beginning of Mosiah. So you really have to believe the Spirit is directing him in the minutest little matters.
Yeah.
And he says that the Spirit tells me to do this for what reason I don't know. So
yeah, I don't know the purpose. It doesn't matter.
Yes, right.
In God's wisdom.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So let's talk a wee bit about mechanics of the dictation, and then we'll talk about sort of like what you see as the sources or influence. So the Book of Mormon as we have it today was dictated in under 85 days. Most faithful scholars that I've read would say it's maybe closer to between 57 to 74 working days, give or take. Some days they were traveling. So let's just say 2.5 months. Would you agree with that time frame? And the witnesses say that there wasn't notes that he was maybe like putting in a hat. There's no manuscript, no books. You can maybe talk later about if you think a Bible was opened and consulted during the dictation. But they would say, yeah, he did it in 2.5 months predominantly with his head in a hat, looking at either the Urim and Thummim or the Seer stone. And we can talk about that as well in a little bit without any notes. Yeah. Would you agree with that time frame and whose mechanics?
I haven't nailed down what I think is the exact number of days, but I go with about 60 days as probably a safe
2 months
number.
Then?
So how much did he have to dictate per day?
It's about 8 pages on roughly, is that right?
Of the first edition. Yeah.
Oh, the first
edition's 588 pages. 500
dividing it by 60.
Yeah. Divided by 60. But the thing is that you should realize that this is a small book. In the books we write today, say this is mine, okay, just go by the size, okay, the size, right? So you see, it's a smaller book, takes more pages. And they print books of Mormon nowadays in that size of book.
Oh, they do?
Out, yeah. And you can find it on Amazon. I showed this last night on Mormonism Live.
I actually didn't know that. I thought they were all like a standard size.
No, well, no, there's even a chat GPT, excuse me, version for Gen Z that uses that kind of slang language for the whole Book of Mormon. Is quite hilarious. But
really?
Oh yeah. Yo, it's Nephi, and I read
some translation. That's a cool translation.
I read some of it last
Gen Z.
night.
They were asked to translate the Book of Mormon. That's
written by Broseph Smith. So but if you change this into this,
Mhm.
it's only a half an inch thick, first of all. And it's 214 pages.
Okay, so you're trying to make the 588 pages less impressive depending on the size of the page, comparing it to
Right,
the size of your
because
book.
there's a translation issue. When we say 588 pages, everybody's going to think of this. They're thinking of this in their minds probably. And I'm trying to say, well, what was Joseph Smith's achievement? We got to put it in the proper perspective. And
Mhm.
it's 214 pages minus 15% for the Isaiah, Malachi, Sermon on the Mount, Micah.
So you would say 214 pages if it's the size of your book. Now, is your book, I don't know standard size of books. Would you say your book is
Yeah,
large
that's
for a book?
no, that's a standard size.
Yours
Yeah.
is standard.
Oh
Okay.
no, it's actually the ones that they're publishing nowadays are this size. The Book of
Hmm.
Mormon. They are this size. This is a standard. If I no, so we actually, can you see this is my first biography, right?
Yes.
And the second biography, you can tell it's slightly bigger pages, right?
Mm-hmm.
We did that on purpose so it would fit into a book size. We made a larger book in order to get more pages in there before it got too big.
Yeah.
So
Because it's 531 pages in the Book of Mormon we have today, 588 in the
yeah,
original manuscript. Okay, but you're
so
just compare it to like, okay, how much is it compared to like, say your
mhm.
book or a standard book? But it's equivalent of what, 270,000 words roughly that was dictated.
Yeah, that's going rounding upwards.
You know what is
From
precise?
Hale's numbers, 269,000 to 300 and something.
Okay, well, it's
But
pretty close to 270. So
so
I looked up, if I divide it by 60 days, as you put, I have 9.8 pages a day.
of first
On
edition
here,
pages.
yes, of
Yeah,
first.
of the pages that I just described, we're talking about 3.5 pages a day.
Okay. And
And that's say roughly 3 hours worth of work
of
per day.
dictation, Oliver the scribe writing it down.
Yeah, and so what is he doing the rest of the time?
Okay, well, so before I ask you that, well, no, this kind of ties in with that. What is your view on the theory or the mechanics of the dictation? So, do you believe Joseph, and you kind of allude to this with, talking about the outlines before each book, and this kind of ties in with William Davis's theory. Do you believe that Joseph was he memorizing and then dictating it? Was he making it up sort of on the fly? Do you believe he was, studying it out in his mind, then praying about it, having sort of like a burning in the bosom? Did he have sort of like the outline in his head, as Davis sort of argues, like a preacher laying down heads, and then he would orally dictate, so like semi extemporaneously? So it wasn't completely off the fly, but it wasn't completely memorized. It was a little bit of, he had an outline, then he expanded upon it. And then after each day, dictation each day, would you view it as he had time to ponder, read the Bible, maybe work out where the story's going to go next? Like, what's your theory of the actual, like, how he was doing it?
Okay. All of the above and then some.
Okay.
So
So you agree with pretty much what I said?
yeah, well, he used whatever method he needed. But my point is he felt inspired on all of it. Not that he could have believed it was real history if he believed it was inspired, but he didn't have to believe it was real history. I mean, there's lots of stories in the Bible that aren't real history, like Jonah and the whale or whatever.
A question somebody would probably want me to ask you is, well, if you believe that Joseph Smith created his own, set of tin plates, so if he's fashioned his own set of plates, why would it not be a delusion for him to think it's not historical, or to believe it is historical if he's made up his own plates, which the historical characters would have supposedly written on? So do you think that Joseph still might have believed it was historical
Well,
then?
some people, not me. I don't I think he's fully conscious of what he's doing. But some people think that maybe there's a degree of self-deception going on. And there's this tendency to want to see Joe Smith as a victim of his own thoughts, and I don't. I think that it was a very hard decision for him to decide to do it. Then he believed that God was commanding him to do it, even though it was, not exactly truthful, or deceiving people for their own good. That's a D&C 19 thing about God deceiving his children to think that punishment is eternal. I think Joe Smith is revealing some of his own complicated thinking in his decision process. I believe the praying, working it out in your mind, praying about it, getting spiritual confirmation through the burning of the bosom or whatever, is his epistemology of truth. And I believe he believed that he was being directed by God through that method. But I don't think he's so delusional that he thinks there's real gold plate. The tin plates were actual gold plates. They were stand-in for real plates that were still in the hill or somewhere. You can go all over the place, but I think he's just totally conscious of what he's doing, but that he's been commanded by God to do it this way. He believes the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth as far as doctrine is concerned.
Yes.
Privately, he has a more nuanced, sophisticated way of thinking, a complex way of thinking about these subjects that he doesn't show other people because it will injure their faith. He wants to nurture faith and grow faith, and he'll do whatever needs to be done to get the best results possible.
Okay, so line upon line, so to speak.
Yeah, and so he knows that he isn't just reading off these stones. He isn't seeing the text on the stone. He's not that delusional. Okay. But he believes it's faith promoting that these people believe he is reading off of the stone, that God is actually translating these plates, the record on these plates. That's the whole idea about pseudepigrapha, is to produce the pseudepigraphists in ancient times produce the actual text. And here it is, and they translate it, and nobody would think there's no ways of detecting forgery back then. But
a wee question I have, Dan. When you talk about Joseph studying it out in his mind, praying about it, seeking a burning in the bosom, do you believe he was doing this during the oral dictation while he had his head in hat? Do you believe he was doing it after, in his free time, pondering it over, or a bit of both? Because I know Oliver Cowdery referred to their translation as like long, hard, like laborious day. So do you believe it was just coming out of him like that, or do you think this, like, when do you think the studying out in his mind was taking place?
Before mostly work it out in your mind, and then get the confirmation, then speak it. So he could be, say, the 3.5 hours that he's not dictating. I believe he's doing spiritual exercises that are sincere,
such as
out in the woods praying for guidance, trying to work out the story in his mind, but presenting it as an actual history in this book. But so God is giving him the story. So some people see that as a possibility that he thought it was real.
Inspired
fiction,
kind of.
I don't happen to think that he knows that. I don't think he believes that there's real Nephites somewhere, and that he's actually dictating a real history through this type of inspiration. I think it's inspired to write a story that people will believe, that has true doctrine in it.
Right. Okay.
And it's the doctrine that he's after, not the story, really. The story is just something to hang the doctrine on.
Right. And
And
would
he's using the mound builder myth, and it's very clever. I mean, once you get into the 19th century and the thinking there, and you see how Joseph Smith uses those ideas and tropes and things and puts them together in this book the way he did, it's amazing. You know,
right.
it's like very, very clever, and using what people already believe mostly, and then as the authority for what he's doing. He's creating his own authority. I mean, pseudepigraphists use, like, say, Abraham and Enoch and whoever, Moses, to give their writing authority.
More credibility rather
Yeah,
than him just producing revelations, claiming that
right.
he's getting revelations from God. Because some people would say, well, why would he have created such a complex book with all these fictional characters? Why not just claim to be a prophet receiving revelations? But you're saying that it adds more credibility because he's produced pseudepigrapha attributing these words to ancient dead prophets.
Yeah. So just say, if he had said, "Oh, I got a revelation, here it is," how many people would he have converted? Probably his
Like,
family.
right. So yeah.
His friends and family, and that'd be it. So in doing it this way, he got the greater good, the more attention than he would have. I mean, nobody who would buy a theological book written by a farm boy. It's just, why should we care about what you say? People are getting revelations all over the place. There's all in the burned over district, especially, there's people getting all sorts of revelations, you
Mm-hmm.
know
Yeah,
and
people claiming visions. So
mhm.
are you
how
saying, and
how do you stand out from that crowd?
right, and I was going to ask, and this maybe ties in with one of the earlier questions about motivations. Would you say that the Book of Mormon, one of the motivations was this is almost like a miracle or a sign or evidence that he's a
Hmm.
prophet of his divine call, and it's sort of a tool for converting people? Would you see
Yes.
that as a motivation as well?
Yep. Well, it's not just a motivation. God has commanded him to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So he has no choice. He's got to do it.
And you believe, under your view of Joe Smith, pious fraud, some sincerity, maybe
Mhm.
mingled with some intentional dishonesty, but you believe, your view of Joe Smith is that he genuinely believed he was sort of commanded to produce this book with the doctrine and the
Mhm.
message in it.
So he is Nephi, who hesitates to cut Laban's head off because he's never broken the commandments. He's always kept the commandments from his youth up. And the Spirit says it's better that one man perish than a whole nation perish in unbelief. That was the decision, okay, that he was faced with. And he was called by God to do it. He believed, okay? He was called by God to do it. That God doesn't command you to do anything that he doesn't prepare the way to do it. And that's what his training and money digging was all about.
Okay. So before we talk about your view of what is maybe inspiration, influences, sources in his milieu, we talked about before that we want to talk a little bit about the Seer stone versus Urim and Thummim. So I'm curious to get your take on it. As I've talked with faithful scholars, and I've done a recent video on it, there's some accounts from certain people, like Lucy talks about feeling the spectacles. There's an account from Emma, David Whitmer, I think Martin Harris, and they all kind of allude to that predominantly during the 116 pages, it was the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles. There's a little bit of gray because I know Martin swaps the stone, during when he was main scribe. So it's like, was he just using the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles exclusively? But then predominantly most eyewitnesses, and there's a lot, like you got David Whitmer, Emma Smith, Michael Morse, who I think is like a member of Emma.
A brother-in-law to Joseph Smith.
Brother-in-law, you've got Elizabeth Cardry, you've got many people, I think Isaac Hale as well, who talk about the main Methodist Joseph putting his seer stone into
Uh-huh.
putting his face in the hat, and they believed he was reading the words as the spiritual light would shine. The recent book I read from Jonathan Neville and James Lucas and the Stollards, they will say that no, these eyewitnesses aren't credible, and Joseph and Oliver just refer to the Urim and Thummim, or the spectacles, and that they're the main, scribes, eyewitnesses of the translation. And those accounts, we can't trust them as much. Maybe they're later, maybe they're trying to refute the Solomon Spaulding manuscript. And to me, I almost see this, I feel like there's so many accounts corroborating the stone in the hat, whether or not spectacles or his seer stone. It seems like there's a lot of consistency that was the mode of translation. But what would be your response to them who say it was only the spectacles and you can't trust any of the seer stone accounts?
Well, their positions are an argument from authority. Joseph Smith said it, therefore that's how it happened, and everybody else is lying. And they got it backwards. Joseph Smith had a lot of motivation to change the story from the seer stone in the hat to the Urim and Thummim, more biblical sounding. He denied money digging too, when he found that his money digging past, it was getting in the way of converting more mainline Christians, he changed his story. He covered up the magical folk magic origins. He wasn't embarrassed about folk magic. That's what got his earliest converts, including his father, was that they believed in folk magic. In their little community in New York, it wasn't a hindrance to believing Joseph Smith's story. Actually, more people believed it than not. I mean, the money diggers believed his story so much that they tried to break the house down to get it.
Yeah.
And they were out hunting for it, and so it was a believable story. I mean, Nibley is famous for saying that at the time Joseph Smith told the story about the plates, it was unbelievable, but now we know that they write on plates. Well, they already knew that the Jews wrote on plates, brass plates, and all sorts of kinds of plates. They knew that was not a secret. Even the Apocrypha talks about writing on brass plates, so it was known. But the money diggers, they are in stark contrast to Nibley's assertion, that people didn't believe Joseph Smith's story. No, they believed it. It made sense that there was a treasure guardian and plates and things like that. And that's Joseph Smith Sr. believed it most of all because he was a money digger. And money digging wasn't separate from religious practice necessarily either. And treasure digger and money guardian spirits and things like that had a religious cast to the story itself. And
could you almost describe magic a bit like folk Christianity, sort of like blended like magic and Christianity, like it's all sort of supernatural, invisible forces, and that was sort of like their view of how the world worked as well, so like their magical worldview in a way, but it wasn't like the occult or worshipping.
The occult just means hidden, but hidden knowledge, it's secret knowledge. Christian magicians, I mean, Barrett's Magus, I mean, it mixes Christianity with folk magic and the occult. The Smiths, it seems, seer stones were in that genre of thinking, seer stones. And there was lots of people using seer stones around Joseph Smith's community. He was in competition with them, actually. And
Sally Chase, who was a local seer in Palmyra.
Yeah.
And so would you see the use of the Urim and Thummim, the emphasis of the Urim and Thummim, is him trying to make it sound more religious, more biblical to new religious converts who may find the folk magic stuff quite superstitious. And like, for example, we talked about this, I remember in our first interview. What chapter is it? Is it D&C 8 or 9 where it talks about the rod? Well, no, it talks about the gift of Aaron, but in the 1833 Book of Commandments, I think it's the gift of the rod or the gift of the sprout, and that it's later changed.
Yeah.
And that always confused me, especially as a missionary, because I was like, what is this gift? Gift of Aaron, like a person? And I was like, then he holds it in his hand. I'm like, I have no idea what this is. And it seems like maybe it's an attempt to move away from the folk magic to make it sound more religious, more biblical.
Yeah.
Could theorize or hypothesize, is that maybe what he's doing, trying to de-emphasize the seer stone in the hat?
Right, because it would impede some people being converted or listening to their story or mocking them and making fun of them. Actually, in the more orthodox circles of Christianity. So it's Joseph Smith changing his story that the Stoddards and Neville should be paying attention to. What's more likely, all these eyewitnesses lying, and for what reason? Lying and deceiving, and they're all getting together. I mean, the first person to ever mention the seer stone was actually Elizabeth Cowdery, and it was in an affidavit that William E. McClellan had collected. He was collecting statements from the witnesses, and he quoted it in a letter to Joseph Smith III. And this affidavit, I think it's dated to 1870, but it's before David Whitmer or anybody else is talking about it, and it's unpublished. I mean, it's only in this William E. McClellan's private papers, and then all of a sudden the other witnesses start telling the same story without even knowing what Elizabeth said about it, and so. And Cowdery's one of the ones they cite as, so it's Joe Smith and Oliver Cowdery together doing the Urim and Thummim story, or interpreters.
And they're the two main principal scribe. Joseph is the one translating, so they're the most reliable ones to trust.
Right. Well, they're the authority, and it's in the official history of the church and some of the other statements that Oliver Cowdery made. Actually, as it turns out, okay, so the term, I listened to Brent Gardner's interview, and he's totally correct that the term Urim and Thummim, it's not the Urim and Thummim, first of all, it's the interpreters. And they're spectacles. Right. They were called spectacles. Had nothing to do with the Old Testament Urim and Thummim. Okay.
Yeah, they were later given that name.
Right. It's not the actual Urim and Thummim. It's a completely different instrument. Probably working totally different. And it has nothing to do with the breastplate, by the way. The breastplate is also added to the story later.
Does it not talk about the breastplate anywhere in the book more? I know, I think it's William Smith is the one who referenced the breastplate in the Urim and Thummim. Am I not remembering that?
Yes, William Smith did.
Right, not in the Book of Mormon.
William Smith is getting his information from Joseph Smith. And the breastplate part of the story isn't introduced into Mormon thought, until 1838 history or thereabouts. I mean, he could have been talking about it before it got into that, but it wasn't part of the original story. The Book of Mormon talks about breastplates from the Jaredites, and that they were large and sound, right?
Okay.
But not in association with the interpreters. The interpreters are, stones in a silver bow,
yes,
right? Like spectacles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Joseph Smith in 1832 history calls them spectacles.
Did the three witnesses in any of their statements, did they ever say about seeing the breastplate laid out in the table? Was that one of the objects they claim to see, like with the Lehi?
It's one of the objects, but it's not in association with the
translation
interpreters.
Okay.
It's connected with the sword of Laban.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So D&C 17, right, given in June 1829, promises the witnesses a view of the plates, and also the Liahona, the directors, the interpreters, in other words, and the sword of Laban and this breastplate. So when you look at them lined up, these objects, here, let's actually quote it here. So DNC 17. Behold, I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, which if you do with full purpose of heart, you shall have a view of the plates and also of the breastplate, the sword of Laban, excuse me, the Urim and Thummim. Well, the original probably didn't say Urim and Thummim because this is 1829. They didn't use that term at this time. So it's been edited, but we don't have an early enough copy of it to
Oh, nor did I.
to show what it originally said. But it probably said interpreters.
Okay.
Which were given to the brother of Jared upon the mount. This would have been before Moses and the Urim and Thummim anyway. But so it became a term for a generic term, even for Abraham using the Urim and Thummim to see the stars with, right?
Mhm.
So it became a term for seer stones. This is like 2 seer stones in
Yeah.
a silver bow. They
Yeah.
work the same. What is the difference? Anyway, but the actual Urim and Thummim in ancient Israel probably were like lots. They were probably black and white. They were in a pocket. They pulled them. They asked a yes and no question, much like the rod, and they pulled them out. And the white one meant yes, and the black one meant no.
Okay.
It's like being blackballed or
So
something.
it was later given the name Urim and Thummim, but they're the Nephite interpreters, or sometimes referred to as the spectacles, which kind of works as seer stones, but in a silver rim. So I'm curious.
Right, like spectacles. So
sure. Kind of like what you're wearing. It looks like the Urim.
Right, Urim and Thummim. So, it didn't go over well, spectacles or whatever. The first time you see some fudging on seer stone versus Urim and Thummim or interpreters is when Oliver Cowdery is testifying in the 1830 Joseph Smith trial.
Mm-hmm.
And he's being retried on the 1826 charges in South Bainbridge, and he pleads statute of limitations, which is more than 3 years, and they had to dismiss it. So they decided to arrest him on the same charge in Colesville. This is like around June, July 1830. And Joseph Smith describes it as he got in trouble because he was preaching the Book of Mormon and causing disrupting the public. And it wasn't really that. It was more about, okay, we're going to try him on the same charge, but here, where the statutes of limitations doesn't apply because we didn't charge him before. So we're going to charge him here. And
using the same stone in the hat method for the dictation
right.
of Mormon as he was using in treasure digging.
Exactly. So they're saying, oh, you're using this stone, and using this stone, a seer stone, is illegal in New York. There's a statute. It's, it's called the Vagrant Act, or the it didn't have to do with fraud as Gardner said. It wasn't fraud. It was
more claiming to see things through
to see
crystal ball,
pretending.
Right. Okay.
Statute said for disorderly persons, right?
Would not be fraud then, because you're kind of like deceiving people.
The law didn't. The law assumed everyone was pretending.
Right. Okay.
It didn't distinguish between true seers and false seers, or
right.
Just doing the act of saying you see in the ground or find lost objects. That was against the law because they assumed everyone was a fraud. And Joseph Smith's defense was, no, I'm a real seer. Josiah Stowel testified that he was a real seer. Jonathan Thompson testified that he was a real seer.
I think his dad got testimony as well.
His father,
yeah,
right? You referred to that as a really neat quote about maybe giving up using his gift for finding filthy lucre.
Yeah, moving more towards righteous purposes, and there's away from sort of like the secular to more spiritual sort of after that.
Right.
Treasure towards translation, I think, is Richard Bushman puts it, orienting himself away.
So his defense was amounted to a confession. Oh, so you're confessing that you did it. They didn't care. That's why when you read the trial record that was published in Utah later, the trial record keeps mentioning pretending, the word pretending, even when it gives Josiah Stowell's testimony,
Right.
So pretending that was the legal thing that they were putting on the record, and that, yes, he's doing it. Josiah Stowell, it doesn't matter if you think we don't care if you think he has a true gift. It doesn't matter. I mean, the people that are being deceived are deceived. So what does it matter what you think,
Yeah.
Because they're the ones being deceived. And so he was, there was enough evidence to proceed with a formal trial. This was just a preliminary hearing in March 1826. And the record shows that they did subpoena witnesses for the next trial. They also notified 2 other justices, because in Chenango County at the time, you had to have 3 justice trials.
Is this 1826 or 1830?
This is 1826.
Okay.
So they were proceeding. So in the 1830 trial, though, as I was mentioning, they were redoing this because they decided not to prosecute him in 1826 because of his youth, which W.D. Purple mentions this, and he kept notes at the trial, and this is where the senior Smith said he wished he would use his gift for other than filthy lucre in 1826.
Yeah, he's the one that recorded that statement. I remember that.
They let him go, and probably because he was a youth, and they didn't actually convict him and or punish him by putting him in prison for 6 months. Another penalty was that you had to leave the county for 6 months. So according to the record of the constable, he conveyed Joseph Smith 10 miles, which probably meant that he was conducted to Joseph Knight Sr.'s farm, 10 miles south of where the trial was conducted. And he couldn't go back into the county for 6 months, which he didn't. But he did go back into Chenango County near Josiah's farm to get married to Emma. And that was more than 6 months
6 months
later.
after. Right.
Yeah. So
that's the most likely outcome of the hearing.
That's my reconstruction. They didn't care about fraud like Gordon Metzen wrote about many years ago in the BYU studies. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't a fraud case. It was just he broke that law that New York had about pretending to see underground.
I see. That's good clarification on that.
Yeah. So in 1830, they failed again because of the statutes of limitations in Chenango County. So they took him to Broome County. As soon as they let him go, they rearrested him, took him down to Broome County, and was trying him on the same charge, not because he was preaching the Book of Mormon, And what happens there, according to Benton, Abraham W. Benton, who was there, and then he reported it in 1831, which is just months after it took place, that on the witness stand, Oliver Cowdery testified that the Book of Mormon was not translated with the Seer stone. It was the spectacles.
Right.
And Benton says, well, I don't see much difference between those two things.
They work the same
so
way.
I think Oliver Cowdery was fudging things. I don't believe it. From I believe the majority of the witnesses, it says that the Urim and Thummim were not used after the loss of 160 pages. Even before that, I don't think the spectacles were used, but for a short while, mostly for copying the characters off the plates.
That was before some of them were taken to some of the scholars.
Yes.
Dude.
So the whole idea that we get of this Urim and Thummim and Joseph Smith being behind a curtain is what Harris told Anthon while he was on that trip in 1828. So Joseph Smith copies the characters and by the Urim and Thummim, he says in his history, translates some of them, but I don't think Anthon saw any translation. He just couldn't read the characters. He verified that they were real, but they had been copied from some book, but they're real. And that's all Harris cared about. They were real characters on those plates. And so Anthon says, tell the person behind the curtain that I'll take the curse of God if you look at the plates, because he says he can't look at the plates. And Anthon says, I'll take the curse on. Tell that person behind the curtain. So he mentioned the curtain. So everyone assumed that Joseph Smith translated from behind a curtain the whole Book of Mormon. And that's how the spaulding theory thrived.
Right, because it could have had a manuscript in there if there was providing them. So are you saying that's the only source we have for the curtain is for Martin Harris when he went to Charles Anton?
Anytime
that would have been before even the 116
pages. Yeah, right, before
so very early on.
So if any translation actually was done behind the curtain, it was for a short while, because both Emma and Martin Harris, who worked on the lost 116 pages, both described this stone in the hat. For hours on end, Emma said. So that was his typical method. If he ever used, how could he use the Urim and Thummim in front of people? Because no one's allowed to see it. Martin Harris's description of the Urim and Thummim in his 1859 interview with Joel Tiffany comes from his visionary experience seeing them on the table. So he can describe he isn't describing any real object. He's describing what he saw in a vision. So he's not describing what Lucy felt under the cloth, if that ever happened, because that is added below the line at the bottom of the page by Martha Corey later. Okay, the 3 diamonds shaped and all of that in the original dictated manuscript isn't like in the text. Okay, so I'm not so sure about where that came from.
So if I'm understanding you right, even though David Whitmer, I think Martin Harris, I know Emma Smith talk about it was the spectacles during the 116 pages, and then it was the Seer stone. Are you saying that you're even skeptical that spectacles were actually used during the 116 pages? When
she didn't say exclusively the spectacles were used.
Okay.
She says they weren't used after the loss of the 116 pages is basically what she's telling people. No, after they were gone, they were taken from Joseph when he lost 116 pages. So anything after that had nothing to do with the spectacles. That's all she's saying. She's not saying it's exclusively they were used, only up until that point, and then after that was the stone. So I think people read too much into some sources like that one. So the idea of the breastplate, though, came when Joseph Smith calls them spectacles in the 1832 history, but in the 1838 history, he says that the angel told him that the interpreters, the 2 stones and a silver bow, when attached to a breastplate, constitute seers in ancient or former times. So that is a myth that's just a continuation of trying to connect it with Aaron's breastplate and the Urim and Thummim.
And then the account of William, does that come before or after Joseph's?
Yeah, way after it. Williams doesn't talk about it. William confessed that he didn't pay much attention to the Book of Mormon or what was going on with Joseph during the time it actually was going on. And Joseph Smith did all this stuff down in Harmony, Pennsylvania anyway. So William was never around. He was one of the younger brothers, and he was too busy being a kid,
Right. Okay.
doing whatever mischief he was doing. But so yeah, that's the story that comes out, and Joseph Smith may have elaborated a story like that at some point, and that William picked up on and repeated. But this is all Joseph Smith trying to shift from magic to a more traditional biblical story, calling the treasure guardian an angel when angels are not mortals.
I know other witnesses mentioned the breastplate with the Urim and Thummim. No. Okay. All right.
Nobody mentions the Urim and Thummim. Nobody mentions the interpreters being used at all. It's always the stone in the hat, except for
Oliver and
Martin Harris's the episode of copying the characters, and that's Joseph Smith in the 1838 history, copying them through the Urim and Thummim, he says,
right,
and translating them. But there was no translation given to Professor Anthony.
Yeah, it was just the copy of some of the characters. Okay.
Yeah.
So your view of the dictation, it was predominantly with the seer stone in the hat. You agree, no notes, no manuscript. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about a Bible if you think a Bible was consulted. But do you think? So we'll talk about maybe some sources. So obviously the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, that was a common sort of theory that there must have been some manuscript that he was reading from. I think you find that in Mormonism Unveiled. You don't see any credibility to the Solomon Spaulding manuscript because they found the manuscript and there's not really good connections there. So you think that isn't a plausible theory?
It makes no historical sense because before Solomon Spaulding story came around, it was Sidney Rigdon wrote it, because Joe Smith wasn't smart enough, and Sidney Rigdon must have wrote it, and somehow they got together.
It was an eloquent order, and he came from the Campbellite movement, so they thought it had to have been more like him. And then they try to connect him that he took the Spaulding manuscript, and then there's even some reports that like some people claim that they saw him going to Harmony, Pennsylvania, Joseph Smith, and there's no evidence for that.
They saw a stranger at Smith's house. It could have been Joseph Knight Sr.
Okay.
Or Josiah Stowel, but they saw a stranger, and in process of time, these vague memories become more like, I'm sure I saw Sidney Rigdon. And so what happened was 1827 was supposedly when Sidney Rigdon visited the Smith farm, and all the Smiths said no, he never came there. Emma talks about she never saw Sidney Rigdon, didn't marry them, and there was all sorts of rumors trying to connect Sidney Rigdon with Joseph Smith. And the story about seeing on the farm was Lorenzo Saunders. And Lorenzo Saunders at first couldn't remember anything until he got with his brother, and they were going through some chronology in their minds, and they finally worked it out. It wasn't like immediate, sure, yeah, absolutely, I saw him. And they only knew and connected it with Sidney Rigdon because Sidney Rigdon came into town after his conversion in 1830. And they were preaching, Joe Smith and Sidney Rigdon, on Main Street, and they saw Sidney Rigdon, so they knew what Sidney Rigdon looked like, and they connected it with that. Okay, so it was a vague memory that becomes more certain through in 1884.
A lot of people are repeating it as well once it starts.
Yeah. And so I usually, on occasions like this, that where we can show that most likely this testimony is vague memory being drawn on later to prove something, is false memory syndrome. And this is true of the Spaulding witnesses as well. Everybody was sincere with the Spaulding thing, especially in the beginning. Later, Spaulding testimony, I am highly suspicious of, because it always shows up when they need it the most. Somebody comes out, oh yeah, I remember something. But the earliest Spaulding testimony, and Hurlbut wasn't doing anything shady. It wasn't even his idea. The Spaulding people that were former friends of Spaulding and his former wife and relatives, when they started hearing the Book of Mormon, about the Book of Mormon, it was vaguely similar to a manuscript that they had heard read to them like 15 years earlier,
Right.
And so I believe that this is like a false memory syndrome. And they only testified to parts that they read in the Book of Mormon. They never like volunteered any stories without reading the Book of Mormon that happened to turn up in the Book of Mormon. You know what I mean? It was
Okay.
always something that they had read. Oh yeah, I remember that. And so that triggers this false memory syndrome. And a lot of studies been done on it. A lady named Elizabeth Loftus is a pioneer in the area, and they would take people and actually implant memories into people. They would interview them, and they didn't tell them why they were interviewing them. They would just say, well, we talked to your family, and they mentioned, and they among other things, they were talking about the person's past, and these are memories that they're supposed to recall. Oh yeah, when I was a child. And then, your family mentioned that you had been lost in a shopping mall when you were young. Do you remember that? And the person would go, not really, maybe, and the more they struggled to pull the memory out, finally it would
That would come.
come.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the shocking thing is that they would re-interview them later, and the person absolutely remembered it. They absolutely remembered. Oh yeah, I remember that very vividly when I was lost in the mall. So so she would do experiments like that and establish this principle, loss false memory syndrome. And that's one of the reasons why, when there's a crime, you don't allow other people to talk to each other, because they can create these false memories in each other. They'll say,
Right.
oh, I saw this, and the other person didn't, but they'll create a memory of it, and
Yeah.
they'll be
It's
totally
odd to their memory.
sincere. They will, yeah, it's tainted. They would be totally sincere on the witness stand. I remember that too. And this person gets convicted on false memory syndrome. It happens all the time.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's why they try not to let witnesses talk to each other and corrupt each other's memories.
Gotcha. So, in the CS letter, there's different arguments against the Book of Mormon, but I would want to get your take on these ones. I maybe see as a little bit weaker in terms of like plagiarism or a source, but Jeremy Runnels pointed to some similar phrasing or phrases between books like the Late War, First Book of Napoleon, and the Book of Mormon. He has a list of phrases. Now, I did a video on it. I've looked at Farrah's response and how there's like between the ellipses, there's like pages in between,
Yeah.
but there's similar, maybe sounding sort of
Yeah.
James, language phrases that show up in both books. Do you see that any evidence or any reason to believe that Joe Smith might have read those books, that it could have been an influence, or do you see it as they're both sort of trying to imitate the King James Bible? So that's why, and it's more of a coincidence that you're seeing some similar phrases.
Yes, I agree. I don't agree that I looked at their parallels, and some of them actually were contrived very and wrongly worded, and but
I agree.
um Book of Mormon didn't say what they were saying on some of them, but it's similar language. And the thing is, I think there's a missed opportunity going on here. I mean, all they did is take the computer, and this is one of the problems with computers is that people think there's some kind of magic machine, but especially now that we have AI kind of stuff. But way back when they were doing all this stuff, there wasn't any of that. And they just had a context. Which book written before the Book of Mormon has more phrases in it similar to the Book of Mormon than any other book? And they come up with this book. And to me, that's totally meaningless. You and most of the parallels are, guess what? In the war sections of the Book of Mormon, in the battle parts of Alma, and the phraseology, they're trying to imitate the King James Version anyway, writing history, and it's mostly like the Book of Chronicles. The Book of Mormon is like the Book of Chronicles in the Old Testament, and people wrote like that in the 19th century. They would write, that like Abner Cole, Obadiah Dogberry in the Palmyra Reflector, the Book of Pukey, and it's written in like even verses, numbered verses, and it's making sarcastic remarks about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and Reverend Reverend Walters, Walters the magician, and it's sarcastic. Well, that was a typical writing style, writing about the politics of the current affairs that were going on. They would imitate the chronicles of so and so, and they would write it in this pseudo biblical style, and that was for entertainment, and to make it interesting, more people would buy your paper. So to find another work that is imitating the Bible style and stuff in the 19th century, and then to say, well, that's the source. Well, that's where you just made your mistake. I don't believe there were any sources used to write the Book of Mormon except the Bible. Because the thing is that try to deny the Bible was used is very difficult,
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of the King James Bible passages, both Testament there. Before we get to the Bible, what about, and this will maybe connect to the first influence we could talk about, is the Mound Builder myth. But before that, what about View of the Hebrews? Because there's, the classic B.H. Roberts where he compared View of the Hebrews, the Book of Mormon, and there's some similar storylines and some parallels between the two books. Do you see any evidence for Joseph Smith maybe reading View of the Hebrews before it? Do you see that as a potential source or influence or not? Or do you see it more as coming from the Mound Builder myth?
B.H. Roberts exaggerated a lot of the evidence, I think. I do not see, he could have read the View of the Hebrews, but can we prove it? No. We can't prove that he read it.
I sometimes see this.
He could have, but prove it. You can't.
Ethan Smith was the pastor of, Oliver Cowdery's family, and then when Oliver Cowdery becomes scribe, he must have brought the View of the Hebrews and then gave it to Joseph Smith. And it's kind of like implied those conspiracies.
It's almost like it's turned into almost like the Spaulding, a new version of the Spaulding theory. So like the Spaulding theory, well, how do you get Sidney Rigdon to Joseph Smith before the Book of Mormon? You can't. So you try to create an intermediary, he's making secret visits. But you say, well, what about Parley P. Pratt is the one that discovered the Book of Mormon on accident because he just happened to go to Western New York and happened to hear about the Book of Mormon. And how could this all be planned? He took the missionaries on their way to the Lamanite mission, the Native Americans in, the Missouri frontier, just happened to say, let's stop by Sidney Rigdon and talk to him. And Sidney Rigdon resists. And then, he pretends to be converted eventually, just playing along. So how do you get this scenario? It starts becoming more of a conspiracy theory, and it starts collapsing under its own weight, actually, in my mind. The same thing with this, the critics going after the View of the Hebrews. There's nothing in the View of the Hebrews that the Book of Mormon even depends on. that isn't in the air. The mound builder myth is everywhere. Okay. And the 10 tribe theory is everywhere. Okay. Joe Smith didn't have to read a single line, anywhere. He
Of
was
you, the Hebrews.
of the View of the Hebrews or any other book. Okay. There's lots of books on the Indians. Now, what the View
So,
of the Hebrews is interesting is that it combines both of those theories into one book. Okay. One
yeah, it has the
theory.
lost 10 tribes,
Yeah.
traveling over to the Americas. I believe, isn't there a split of like a white skin, dark skin
Well,
people?
yeah, and there's a reason he had to do that. Okay, because he blended the two theories. And the 10 tribe theory says that the um, Native Americans are of the 10 tribes. And the 10 tribes, according to the book of Esdras in the Apocrypha,
Hmm.
went to a land where never mankind dwelt.
Hmm.
So no one can be there.
Right.
So if you had two migrations, separate migrations, you would have the Native Americans coming to a land where there's already people,
Hmm.
the mound builders.
Right.
Okay. And they destroy the mound builders because they're not as civilized, and the mound builders are civilized, and destroy them. So if there's two migrations, you would have a problem with that. Also, some people have theorized that the Americas were inhabited when the dispersion took place at the Tower of Babel.
Hmm.
So you couldn't have the Tower of Babel story because they would be there already before the 10 tribes came. So
Okay.
Joseph Smith, in rejecting the 10 tribe theory, but accepting the Hebrew origin story, which they
Israelite origin.
Israelite origin coming instead from the northern 10 tribe area. Joseph Smith has them come from Jerusalem, from Judah, the southern kingdom,
Right.
at a later period. The 10 tribes leave according to history, they left. They didn't really, but they got dispersed by the Assyrians, and intermixed, dispersed.
Hmm.
Um, it's around 721 BC, somewhere around there. And the Babylonians took over and carried away the Jews captive, around 598, BC is what the date is, even though it could probably, move around a little bit. But so it's an easier story to tell. You couldn't tell if you tried to tell the 10 tribes came over to America. I mean, that would be an impossible story to try to recreate, in a record. You would
Because apologists
eventually,
sometimes say, because you're saying that the Nephites and the Lamanites is Joseph being influenced by the mound builder myth, which in a nutshell, there's like they're seeing all these mounds and things, but because of maybe racist views of the Native Americans, they didn't think that they were like civilized enough to have created these things, so
yeah.
they hypothesized that there was a superior white race that was wiped out
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that they descend from Israel. That's sort of the mound builder myth in a nutshell.
Okay. So, yes, that's the
And how
racist
prevalent
part.
was it in 19th century America and in
Hmm.
Joseph's environment?
Yeah, they were looking for various biblical solutions because they wanted to connect the new world with the old world in order to make the new world um, not contradict the theology of the Bible. And that is, when they found Native Americans, were they descendants from Adam or not? And if they're not, are they a separate creation maybe from God, and that they don't have souls like people in the old world? And so it's not the same as if you're going to wipe the Indian out and take all their land and stuff. It's not as bad if they don't have souls, and they're not related to Adam. And Jesus hasn't saved them because he saved the people in the old world from Adam's fall. And if these people aren't subject to Adam's fall, then why convert them? What's the use? So we could just remove them out of the way and take their land. So Ethan Smith and his type were trying to connect them to the 10 tribes in order to save the Indian.
Right, because that was almost like indication to wipe them out then. They're just these savage Native Americans. We don't even know if they're human, but trying to connect them to Israelites then is a way to, care for them, try to preserve them and convert them.
Right. And that's our job. I mean, he's a minister, right? So yeah, it's our job to convert them and save them. And by doing that, we fulfill Old Testament prophecy that has to take place before Jesus' return. So it's all prophetic. And
like the restoration of the lost 10 tribes and the Jews again.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So not everyone that connected the Indians to Jewish heritage promoted the 10 tribe theory. They were mostly interested in making parallels between Hebrew and Indian spoken language.
It wasn't exclusive to the lost 10 tribes, because I've read apologists would say that, but the Book of Mormon doesn't talk about, the lost 10 tribes. As you said, it was the southern tribes that from. So it's not identical to the mound builder myth and not necessarily taking.
Right. So not everyone had believed the mound builder myth associated it with the 10 tribes either. Like Solomon Spaulding. Solomon Spaulding, so his story was that the mound builders were here. Nobody knows who the mound builders are. They're building stuff. And then this Roman ship gets off course and lands in America, and they speak Latin, which Spaulding knows how to translate, right? So so they write a record about the mound builders. And so that's how he gets to introduce the idea of who the mound builders are through the people that come to America. Well, so if the mound builders were already there, like Solomon Spaulding has it, and then if these people say it was the 10 tribes that came, well, they couldn't come to an uninhabited land. So he has people of Roman heritage come and they write a record about and describe the mound builders and what they were doing, and his version copies what was really known about the mound builders closer than even the Book of Mormon does. He actually copies the Kentuckians, the Tennesseans and the different tribes that were active in the heartland, but the mound builder myth was hemispheric. It wasn't limited to North America. The people that were blown off course from Rome, they came to the North American mound builders and described their culture, just like what Solomon Spaulding saw. They saw these mounds. They walked among these mounds. There was 3 kinds of mounds: temple mounds that used to have a structure on them, a temple, but it was an artificial mound. Then there were fortification mounds, and these were ridges of earth in circular form. A lot of them were circular, and there were other shapes, but that had picket works on the top of them that had been destroyed through time. And then there were burial mounds full of bodies that they hypothesized were there because there was some terrible battle in the Great Lakes region that destroyed the white race of mound builders.
Okay,
so
see
Joseph.
So I was going to say, you would see that mound builder myth as it was very prevalent in the environment. So like everyone would have been familiar with it, whether or not you were reading books or not. Like these were sort of theories about in origins, and you believe that this would have been an influence for the Nephites and the Lamanites, because there's white skin, dark skin, and then the Nephites get wiped out at the end. And you would say that is an influence for Joseph trying to explain the origins of the Native Americans.
Well, that's the way everybody read it until they didn't want to read it that way anymore. And so it made perfect sense. The history in the Book of Mormon didn't stand out. I mean, it was part of the accepted part of the Book of Mormon, nobody was focusing on the history, the mound builders. Nobody was questioning the mound builder myth. Nobody.
So they almost might have,
Until late
but
in the 19th century.
so they almost would have seen the book aligning with those theories. Do you speculate
It
that
was
would have?
invisible to some readers. It
Hmm.
was, nobody, it was just accepted
Hmm.
as being the history of what it was, exactly what they would expect to be in such a book.
Right. That would have been supportive to it being authentic then.
Yeah, and it answered some of the particulars of the theory. There were different versions of the theory, mound builder theory, but the mound builder theory overall was unquestioned.
Right. Okay. I've
And
not actually seen, I did a bit of research on it. I've not seen a whole lot of apologetics. I don't know if any people respond to your book specifically on, Mounds and Indian
no,
Warriors. I've not seen a whole lot of apologetics on it, but one would be that a lot of people saw the Native Americans as, living in small villages and tribes and things. But the Book of Mormon talks about like very advanced civilizations, cities. I think there's a quote from David Whitmer when he, after his vision of the angel, he says something along the lines of the people won't believe us because we talk about the ancient Native Americans dwelling in like large, sophisticated cities, these big civilizations, and that would not go in line with the mound builder myth. What would be your response to that?
well,
Basically, they're arguing
the
that
Indian,
Mormon isn't just taking the mound builder myth and
yeah,
putting it in the Book of Mormon. I don't know if you've
yeah,
heard the argument.
no, not really. But I would point out that I remember all those descriptions of the Lamanites of being wild. I mean, they still have that city of Nephi, that first temple, and there is some palaces and buildings mentioned, but for the most part, they live in tents. They eat raw meat and they hunt, and they're hunters instead of farmers. And they wear a loin skin around, animal skins around their loins, and they're
Mm-hmm.
naked. Otherwise, they paint their faces. They, you know, take scalps. So um, the portrayal of the Lamanites is stereotypical of how the whites viewed Native Americans in Joseph Smith's day.
Okay.
And so it has all of those kind of stereotype images, and the mound builders are the more civilized, the lost race of mound builders, were more civilized than the Indians. Indians couldn't have built these structures. And people in Joseph Smith's day knew about Peru, the Incas. They knew about the Incas in Peru. They knew about the Aztecs. They're kind of later, but they knew the Aztecs built mighty cities, and that there were ruins down in South America and Central America. They viewed the Great Plains as once a forest that were cleared off by the large number of inhabitants of these mound builders that were finally destroyed in the Great Lakes region, probably in Western New York.
Mm-hmm.
So they viewed it, the 1824 history of New York, 1824 history of New York, written by Yates and Moulton, talked about this chain of ruins from South America on up through Mexico, on up into North America, where they were destroyed. So the mound builder geography was hemispheric, and they saw the mound builders as unitary civilization, and they saw the Indians as having one origin, you know, uh, the 10 tribes, or Hebrew. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
And so they saw all in the early Mormons had all these same views. The Lamanites, every Indian was a Lamanite. There was no exception. They went to Missouri to preach to the Lamanites.
Mm-hmm.
Those were Lamanites. They were fulfilling Book of Mormon prophecy by preaching to the Native Americans. The Revelations told them to go preach to the Lamanites. And so they went. And the New Jerusalem temple was supposed to be built in among the Lamanites,
In Missouri.
Yeah, it was supposed to be over the border into Indian territory at first. And they were kicked out of there. And so the prophecy that says to build the New Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem shall be found among the Lamanites, was subsequently changed to in the borders by the Lamanites. So the original plan was to build in Indian territory, the theocracy, the New Jerusalem theocracy.
No, I think I can't really remember this too well, so I can't really push back on what you're saying. I know the Book of Mormon does describe the Lamanites being like savage and wild and wearing loins.
Except for the 200 years of the golden era of the Book of Mormon.
Well, yes, because I know
when Jesus comes.
Well, there's a chapter in Brant Gardner's book, and I can't remember, but he describes when Ammon and his brethren go to the Lamanites that there's implicit references to actually they live in quite actually very highly civilized and even greater cities than the Nephites. I can't remember specific arguments he makes, but I remember reading about that in his book, and he might say that, oh, well, maybe it's just the Nephites being very prejudiced and racist towards the Lamanites, that they're savage and they're cursed. But actually, when Ammon and his brethren go to convert the Lamanites, it actually describes them living in very refined, high civilized, huge cities. But he would maybe push back and say that the Book of Mormon, if you look at it more in depth, particularly like say when Ammon goes to visit the Lamanites, they're not just savage barbarians, but I know they are described early on in the Book of Mormon as being
earlier, which was written.
It was like Enos
last,
talks about it.
But yes, and maybe Jacob, but Enos, talks about how ferocious and whatever they are, and so it might not be 100% one way, describing them as hunters and the Nephites as peaceful. Of course, the Nephites built a temple like Solomon's temple and then had to leave, so that was still around. So it might be more complex of a picture, but
I think you would see it as the Nephites are ethnocentric and they're also very us versus them. I think that was what he argued in his book.
Yeah, I know the new geographers, as I call them, and I don't buy their geography at all.
What? We'll talk about that in part 2.
I never have, even when I was a Mormon, knew that they were off on their geography. So they're forcing it. They're forcing it too much, manipulating it way too much. But so I don't buy it
too, because I want to bring that up with you. So you would see the Mound Builder myth as that's an influence and maybe a source, not that he's plagiarizing.
I think it's obvious. Obvious. It's so obvious. How can you deny it? Kind of a thing. And people, they try to deny it. Oh, the Book of Mormon doesn't mention canoes or buffalo. Stuff. That's not an argument against the Mound Builder myth. Even Solomon Spaulding had horses in his Mound Builder myth story. So there's a lot of things that they assumed, and he didn't write about certain things either. But that would be an argument from silence. The Mound Builder myth to me is just so plain. It's just hard to deny. And when you try to deny it, in my view, you just look silly.
Okay. Right. So let's talk about next then the King James Bible. I think that one is, you said, you can't really dispute the King James Bible is in the Book of Mormon. You've got long chapters of Isaiah, maybe not copied word for word verbatim, but there's definitely a dependence on the King James Bible, maybe some interaction with italics. You've got the Sermon at the Temple being very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. Again, some variations. And even throughout the Book of Mormon, there's lots of, and this has actually been more apparent to me as I've read the Book of Mormon again, as I've done a little bit more research. There's loads of small intertextual phrases from the King James Bible, both Old and New Testament. You have Paul's Sermon on Charity shows up in Moroni 7. So there's definitely a dependence on the King James Bible. So I want to get your view, because the faithful scholars might say, well, it's Joseph Smith as the translator. He's translating it into his language, his vocabulary, using the King James Bible to clothe the translation, and it's more applicable to the religious audience of his day. And it might be he's rendering the translation, but the meaning of the plates. So it's not like a word for word, but it's like a sufficient translation, should we say? But to yourself, a naturalist or an unbeliever, do you view the King James Bible as is Joseph Smith? So I'll ask you a few questions about this. Do you see it as Joseph Smith is reciting and speaking quite fluently in the King James Bible, that he knew it really well? Do you see him at times he had to have been consulting a Bible for the long chapters? Like, give me your theory on how he was engaging with the King James Bible, how it showed up in the Book of Mormon. And I'll ask a couple of follow-ups.
Okay, so to me, the use of the King James Bible is undeniable.
Yes.
I don't think he had 20 some odd chapters memorized and just repeated them, making changes along the way. I think at some point his head was out of the hat. Now, some people try to read those head in the hat passages as being absolute, like that's it. He never took his head out of the hat. It's, kept his head in the hat and recited everything. And so it was a miracle. You either believe, that he could memorize these huge
because unless he had a eidetic photographic memory, I don't think he could write long chapters of Isaiah with just his head in the hat.
Yeah, or he took his head out of the hat at some point. Okay, so when the witnesses were talking about the head in the hat and the stone, and they were describing a typical translation day, they weren't. I wish I were there. I could ask him more questions. You wish you would have a step-by-step, detailed description. Please give it to us. So they didn't. They gave the briefest statements, really. And it was mostly to counteract the spaulding theory.
Right. Do you think they were trying to make it more miraculous? I think you would say that they were sincere believers.
Yeah.
They believed it was by the gift and power of God.
Yeah.
Do you think they were overstating things, or it was simplified?
Well, we are talking to people that believed the miracle. Okay. They saw a phenomenon that they couldn't do themselves, and it looked miraculous to them. And that was all intentional. That's Joseph Smith's purpose, was to create a miracle as the foundation for his, at first it might not have been, but eventually became the foundational document of the new religion. And it was founded and inaugurated with a miracle, the Book of Mormon. It was all in that was the intention. Okay. So they are thinking about what happened later and recounting things. And Emma would mention, he corrected my spelling, or he spelled out the names and things like that. And he would start right where he left off without even looking. Well, yeah, maybe she was impressed by those situations, but there's probably many things that were going on that were not exactly the same every day. But she's describing a typical experience. Now, as an amateur magician, I learned a long time ago that when you do a trick and then you ask people to, when you hear people telling another friend the trick I showed them, it was always more miraculous than I could actually do. I would say to myself, if I did it that way, I would never be able to do it. I actually did it quite differently than what they remember seeing, because they were fooled. They're describing the impression you're trying to give them when you're doing a magic trick. You know what I mean? This is what I'm trying to pretend to do. But they don't notice the subtle misdirection or a slightly different way you actually did it. You know what I mean? So I could never listen to somebody telling me a trick that they saw They'll go, okay, I saw this guy do this trick and he did this and this and then this. And I'm supposed to figure out how the guy did it by their description. It's not possible. Okay. Because they were fooled.
Right. There's no way
they
he
don't
could
have
that they
they don't
saw.
have the information that I really need to figure it out. I'd have to actually be able to see it, to maybe figure it out. There's no guarantee I'll figure it out, but most of the time I do. Okay. So so we're listening to testimony of people like that. I did an experiment one time with people on a critical board, Mormon discussions, and I was trying to explain to them that Emma's not being deceptive. It's an exaggerated description, and she is concerned, and especially Martin Harris, is concerned to say, I wasn't a schmuck. I wasn't fooled. I'm not that easily fooled. He's trying to say I was skeptical, and I had every reason to believe. So they're worried about their own reputation in a way when they're telling the story, but they're not being deceptive. They're recalling.
No, I don't see it that way.
What is there? They're recalling what is there, but it might not necessarily be exactly how it really happened. And Joseph Smith didn't correct all of Emma's misspellings, because you could look at the original manuscript and see that,
Yeah.
So she's not being deceptive or dishonest.
I think there's some evidence when it comes to names from the original manuscript that those were, spelt out. I think Coriantumr, Skousen talks about, Oliver wrote it one way and then it was changed.
Yeah.
When it came to names, he did correct their spelling, so maybe they assumed that that's he was always doing that. It was inerrant. It had to be written down correctly before it could move on. So getting back to the Bible, so you're saying that he could have taken his head out of the hat, looked at a King James Bible. He probably would have had to for the Isaiah chapters or the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
You not think that some of the witnesses might have been like, hold on, what are you doing? Like, why are you looking at the Bible?
No.
Why not?
Why? So he says, well, this is chapters out of Isaiah, and I believe he probably did it just like he did the inspired revision. Okay,
of the Bible.
Yeah,
looking at the text,
the inspired revision of the Bible. He did that like immediately after publishing the Book of Mormon, like in June. March is when the Book of Mormon comes out. By June, he's already doing the inspired revision, dictating chapters, though. And then they actually purchase, while they're still in New York, a Bible that they used, Oliver Cowdery and Joe Smith, for the inspired revision, and they wrote in it. Okay. Later, they invented a quicker method of just writing down the change, and using the Bible and writing down the change instead of the whole Bible text, So,
so you do think
so if he had said,
suspicious, if he was like,
why? Everybody knows the Book of Mormon quotes the Bible. There's nobody tried to hide anything. It's out in the open, transparently, that the Book of Mormon quotes Isaiah. So if he pulled out Isaiah and said, well, it's almost the same. And if he actually took a Bible out, because they had a Bible, and crossed some things out and made some changes in the column and just said, here, copy this, or I'll read it to you, or somebody else will read it to you while I do something else, nobody would have thought anything of it, because no one's going to say, no, you got to read it off of that stone
only off the
to
stone.
us that you're not cheating, whatever.
They still would have seen it as a divine translation, even if he was saying, oh, this passage, this looks like a chapter of Isaiah.
Yeah.
I can just read it from the King James Bible.
Right. To help speed up the process, I'll just read it out of here, and I'll make the changes that I see need to be made. And that's how he proceeded. Nobody would thought anything of it. And why would they mention it? They didn't mention the translation process in detail in the first place. They only mentioned the stone in the hat because they were trying to say, no, It wasn't behind a curtain. It wasn't behind the curtain. He didn't read it behind the curtain. He did it in front of us. So that's what they're concerned with, demolishing that theory. Not that they're deceiving or anything. They're just saying no, because Neville and others will try to say, oh, these people are lying just to they're well-meaning, trying to destroy the spaulding theory, and they're lying. And Joseph Smith told the truth. It was done with the spectacles. And if they were done with the spectacles, it would have to be behind a curtain, and so because nobody could see.
Yeah.
Nobody can see the spectacles.
Or else he put them in the hat, but nobody
I don't think they would fit. They're supposed to be bigger than a man's head, right?
You think they would have been
and his head is this big, and the glasses are this big, So I would have they would be in there like sideways, and some people say it takes one stone out. Well, that's all what you call an ad hoc hypothesis. You're trying to keep the spectacles in the story, so you're adding something to the story that nobody ever said or thought of at the time except you, trying to solve a modern problem, that you created. So
with
this is what happens when you go away from the historical record and then you start trying to fix your own problem.
Okay. So with the King James Bible, some apologists have said that, because you talked about how Oliver and Joseph purchased a Bible before the inspired revision, some have said that we don't even know if Joseph actually had a Bible when he was. But you're saying he must have, but they're saying, is there any evidence he did? Do you think there could have easily been access to one? Maybe someone in the house? Like, what's your view?
Everybody has a Bible.
So there could have been access if he was at the Whitmer home. They could have.
I guarantee you, there's nobody walking around except the deists, maybe, or even them. Even the deists read the Bible. So everybody's reading the Bible. Joseph Smith doesn't talk in Bible language, which he does, because we could tell by the letters he wrote in 1830 that he knows the Bible inside and out. Okay. And he doesn't quote the Bible. Okay. That's the
paraphrases it.
Point. He paraphrases it, and he uses just the language of the Bible to create whatever idea he needs. He's using the Bible language in a creative way. He isn't just citing it as proof of something. It's ingrained in his language when you read his letters written in 1830. And I'm not the only one saying this. What's his name? Frederick, New Testament, a professor. I just was quoting it. Nicholas Fredericks.
Oh, I don't know.
Anyway.
Well, I remember reading in.
I quoted it on Mormonism Live last night, actually. So
it comes back to you can say the name, but I remember reading in Grant Palmer's book, and he sort of is laying out sort of like a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon. And I actually thought this was quite interesting because I think it was Doctrine and Covenants 4. He showed how that revelation is made up of lots of small King James Bible quotations, both from the Old and the New Testament. Now, a believer could still argue, it's inspired, it's revelation, but I think he was trying to make the argument that there's so many small King James Bible phrases, maybe not that Joe Smith is going to a Bible for every single phrase, but that
he isn't.
Yeah, that he's fluent in the Bible and he's able to interweave it together in quite a coherent way. Do you see that with the smaller phrases or verses that show up in the book more that are either quoted verbatim or very similar? Would you see it as Joe Smith was just able to recite parts of the King James Bible, both from reading the Bible or attending sermons and things?
That's his language. Yeah, I say he speaks fluent Bible. And a lot of people at the time could. And that's why he's using it. He gives his speech a little more authority when he can sound like, have a pseudo-biblical language. And those could be explained as translation, artifacts of just Joe Smith translating. but the longer ones can't. I know Brant Gardner tried to say that, and some others tried to say that he just used the Bible, and then he uses Blake Osler's expansionist theory, where they try to explain the longer Bible references that he shouldn't even know because they haven't been written yet. They're in the New Testament. The longer ones, or what we mentioned, faith, hope, and charity,
Yeah.
being copied almost 12 verses, and that is very hard to believe that a Nephite actually quoted those on the gold plates,
word for word. I think their argument is maybe it was a similar writings on the gold plates rendered, and he rendered the translation in the King James Bible. You may not buy that because you would see it as, if it's a very long passage, it would be dead similar. Now they could say maybe God can reveal very similar meaning or concepts, but they would argue the word for word is product of the translation versus.
So where do you get your definition of translation? There's nobody translates like that. I don't care what they say. That is not a true definition of translation. What's going on is that you are creating a definition of translation that you need to explain problems in the Book of Mormon, textual anachronisms, and sometimes historical anachronisms. So what you do, you say, well, how can you prove the Book of Mormon is a modern production? And here's these literary anachronisms, and then you adjust the translation to account for them, so you invalidate the whole test. There's no test, so you've just made it impossible to find counter evidence to the Book of Mormon.
Suppose what they would probably say, probably my response would be to that, is if it's a literal word for word translation, then yes, those anachronisms or modern elements would show that this isn't historical. If it's a functional translation, that it's not like a literally word for word, but it's functionally equivalent. So like an example apologists have given is when the King James translators translated, like Jesus and oil lamps in the,
I heard that example.
Yeah, but the King James translators translated it, instead of oil lamps, they used like candlestick. Don't put your candle under a bushel.
Yeah,
like an anachronism. But they would argue that, well, that anachronism is a translator's anachronism, is to be more readable to the audience. But that doesn't mean that the manuscript they're translating from is, not dated to Jesus's time. So I think they would say that, the King James Bible passages, you could be right, Dan, but they could say that maybe this is Joseph, by inspiration, rendering it in King James Bible translation.
Well, every translation, every word in every translation is anachronistic in that sense. Because you're translating it over to your culture, so it's going to be anachronistic.
Well, yes, and that's sort of their argument that, and when we talk about this more in part two, but that the 19th century elements, so to speak, or those modern anachronisms, may not necessarily mean it's definitely 19th century text. And we'll talk about this more in part two. They might argue, but is there some ancient elements? Does it align with history? And then to harmonize, maybe it's viewing the translation a different way. And that was sort of, did you watch the interview I did with Brant Gardner? It was like,
I watched that one, but I didn't watch the convergence one.
Oh,
so
well, you have to watch.
But I can still keep up a little bit here.
Oh yeah. But anyway, getting back to the King James Bible, one last comment I want to make, or question, is some people have quoted his mother saying that Joseph wasn't as interested in the perusal of books, or that like in 1823, I think when he was telling the stories, like he'd never read the Bible through his whole life. And they're saying that, or they're maybe trying to argue that if you look at those quotes, people around him are saying that maybe he didn't know the Bible as well as what critics are claiming he had to be able to memorize and recite these passages, because family or friends are saying he didn't know the Bible that well. Now, I actually think there's a bit of pushback to that statement, because Joseph Smith talks about in his first vision accounts searching diligently the Bible, and I think he actually would have been quite familiar with it. But what would be your response to that argument?
Well, as soon as, like I mentioned, those 1830 letters shows that he does know the Bible really well. He says that he searched the scriptures because he was troubled over his the different denominations. He knew them
That's
very
right.
well also. Okay, he more or less, he's saying he knows all the scriptures, he knows all the arguments, that are debated on, what's the name of the church, the proper mode of baptism, and all those kinds of subjects that they were debating at the time. He has an intimate
Yeah, he would have been
knowledge of all of
familiar.
that, and he knows the Bible, because you can't have an intimate knowledge of all of those theological issues without knowing anything about the Bible and their scriptural proof texting of it. And to me, the Book of Mormon shows he's very familiar with all those arguments. And so the 1830 letters, the two to the Colesville Saints,
I'll have
show
to
that
reread those to see, but you're saying there's KJV,
Hendrick's son, or
there's
anyway,
phrases, KJV phrases or paraphrases in there.
yes, it's peppered with biblical phraseology. Okay, so I'll get it for you for just a second
Oh,
here.
that's fine. So you're basically arguing that, and who knows, maybe he hadn't read the Bible from front, start to end, but he still either could have been quite familiar with it. He could have studied it very deeply. Like before I'd read the Book of Mormon through from start to finish, I actually think I would have studied it. I would have studied parts, topics, those sorts of things. So even if he
So I
had
think
start to finish,
Lucy is exaggerating.
so you think he's trying to dumb him down as well?
Well, he said to her, I can go in the woods with my Bible and learn more in an hour than I can going, to all these meetings. That's when he was upset with the
So you would,
minister.
if apologists would try to argue that he really didn't know the Bible that well, you wouldn't see that as a credible argument.
No, I think that would be silly. I mean, he was a Methodist exhorter, right? In his youth, a passable exhorter. And
Wasn't he part of like a juvenile debate club as well for a
a juvenile
bit?
debate club, and they were arguing probably about theology as well. So um
So yes, I would actually agree with you. Whether or not
yeah.
you believe he could have recited long passages by himself by inspiration, or maybe in your view, maybe he whipped out a Bible for the very long parts. But I would have to agree that
Oh, here it is.
looking at the history, that he would have been quite well acquainted with the Bible. To what extent, I'm not fully sure.
So so Lucy says he didn't read it all the way through, which, why would you have to? But his favorite was Isaiah, probably, just like Nephi's favorite was Isaiah. Nicholas Frederick, and he published an article in the Journal of Mormon History in 2021, having many things to write to you. That's probably a phrase from one of those letters. Biblical intertextuality in Joseph Smith's two Colesville letters. So he says dozens of Smith's letters are extant, many of which incorporate the language of the Bible in ways that are similar to his scriptural texts.
Is this an article?
Yeah, in the Journal of Mormon History, and he's a associate professor of ancient scripture at BYU.
Okay.
And he wrote this article, and he says this is volume 47, number 2, which is April 2021.
What we could reading is you could possibly send that to me, and I could link that in this description. Okay. I want to read it as well.
Yeah. All right. He says, over the course of this article, I argue that Joseph Smith's two Colesville letters display a remarkably complex intertextuality with the Bible that puts them, at the very least, on a par with his canonized revelations. Due to these intertextual similarities, I will suggest that Joseph Smith's letters must become part of the conversation when we talk about Joseph Smith and his biblical projects, whether it means the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, or Joseph Smith's Bible translation. So,
Okay.
and the important point is that he's not just using the Bible as a proof text. He's not citing, actually, in these letters, he's not citing any text for a
Speaking
proof
in
text.
KJV
It's just
language.
interwoven in his language,
Right.
And so
And is that
the
similar
book,
to how preachers would have
and
spoken?
that could be answered by the translation. That if Joseph Smith was translating, that's
Sure.
what it would sound like,
But also, would you say that he would have been hearing that from preachers as well? Would they have been doing
Right.
that similar? Methodist preachers, particularly.
Yeah, and they would be doing this impromptu style and extemporaneously, because Methodists did not write sermons. That they prided
Right.
themselves on speaking from the heart. So Joseph Smith was
Like being
used to
directed by
that.
the spirits.
Yeah, exactly. And when it flowed, when a preacher felt the flow, they felt the Spirit directing them in what they're saying. And I believe that's the state of mind that Joseph Smith achieved while he's translating the Book of Mormon for the most part.
Right. So do you almost see it? What's that quote where he talks about the spirit of revelation when you have sudden stroke of ideas and like intelligence coming to your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Would you see that as that sort of like his what's the word, like paradigm for, or his understanding for like this is the spirit of revelation working in when that's happening?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Instead of having a stupid thought, which this is the opposite.
Right. Okay.
So yeah. So I believe he lived by that. He felt that. He, sermonized on that basis like a Methodist would.
So the King James Bible was a source, and that was an influence, and it's indisputed. Like believers, faithful scholars, if you read the Book of Mormon, the King James Bible is in there. However you want to interpret it, coming from Joseph naturally, or part of the translation. I know me growing up as a believer, it's kind of naive looking back, but I just assumed that like, hey, that God talks in King James Bible English, and he speaks the same words. That would have been my very simplistic view of it. But now realizing like that wouldn't work. But connecting with that, so we talked a little about revivalist language. In I think you talk about it a little bit in your book. Grant Palmer does in his book, and William Davis, especially Grant Palmer. He's got like a chapter about some of the sermons in the Book of Mormon, or conversion experiences, born again experiences, being quite similar to revivalist sermons, or people having conversion experiences. Some of the phrasing like, sing the songs of redeeming love, or the pains of Adam, arguing that sounds very much revivalist. And again, the apologetic position is that, people are having giving certain sermons and having similar conversion experiences, and it's part of the clothing of the translation with his language and vernacular. But if this is naturalistic, would you say this is Joseph trying to imitate preachers that he's hearing, and maybe the conversion experiences he's witnessing at revivals and things?
Yeah, it's very 19th century theology and revival language, as well as descriptions of people falling down with the falling power in the Book of Mormon. That happens. So now on the language, though, revival and biblical language, with the translation deal, I draw the line with longer things, and I don't think the expansionist theory answers that. The expansionist theory can't be tested because of that, because what doesn't fit is expansion, and what you can find ancient proof of is ancient, and so you have an answer for everything, and there's no way to test the theory. There's no way to test the theory. But it's just a little, you're asking a lot of people to believe that, Joseph Smith is just expanding the ancient text, because they, and to me, it sounds like, well, they just don't have an answer for that. They don't have an ancient parallel when they're waiting to get an ancient parallel. You take that off of that list and put it on this other list, and vice versa. So you can any evidence that comes forward to show its modern production. Oh yeah, that was his inspired expansion. So there's no way to get out of that apologetic. It's just a little too convenient. And so if
Or
you believe it, you believe it, I guess. But
okay.
I just can't. It's a you just now just invalidated any kind of testing of the Book of Mormon. Can't be tested. So why brag about anything? You know. So
All right, so
you can.
you would see that.
Why do you get to brag about the stuff you think have ancient parallels, and I can't no longer point out any modern anachronisms? So it's sort of like heads you win, tails you lose.
Right. And I think to clarify, because as I've dived deeper, because going into this, I was just like, okay, there's tight versus loose. And then I read up Frank Gardner's, and his is a little bit different to Blake. You probably just all see it as all kind of loose. Frank Gardner's, I mean, we can talk more about this in part two, because I don't want to spend too much on the apologetics in this part, but he would see it as it's more of the meaning of the plates is being retained, but it's Joseph's language, vernacular, his vocabulary. I think Blake's is more, yes, this is maybe an expansion part. So Blake would say this might not have been on the ancient gold plates. This is Joseph's expansion. So I think they have a bit of a difference in their theory for translation. Maybe some overlap, just to clarify. Yeah. But I know what you mean. How you?
I know his functional translation. Functional translation.
Functional. Yes.
Gardner.
Yes.
Uses that term, functional translation.
Yes. And for me, when we talk about this more in part two, I find that probably all of the translation theories, the most reasonable. I think it's probably the one which is the best explanation. But we'll talk about.
Well, it's the most thought out one.
Yes, that's my view. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it tries to do its best to account for.
So I appreciate that part of it.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that more in part two. So going back to revivalist language, sermons, conversion experiences, you would just see that this is Joseph Smith imitating and putting that into his made up, Book of Mormon to be appealing to the religious people of the day.
Well, he doesn't know anything else. So you can't write about stuff you don't know about. And so he's writing about stuff he knows about.
Okay. Let's see. Another source or influence you talk about in your book is, and you've done videos on it, is that anti-Masonic rhetoric. You see that being reflected in the Book of Mormon with the Gadianton robbers, secret oaths and secret combinations. I did a recent video on it, but
I saw some of that.
Yes, and I referenced you in it, and
I thought you were fair about trying to give both sides, and
oh, thank you.
It's not totally resolved,
Yes, yeah.
Here are the issues. Here are the, give and take of the two sides. I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate it because I know you did a video response, and I was like, "Oh darn!" I was like, I have to represent this," and I was like, "How do I represent because it's over an hour? I think that video you did 1 hour and 10 minutes, maybe. How long was it?
I don't remember.
Quite long. But I was like, let me. So I watched the whole thing, and I took wee notes.
Oh,
didn't respond back to the apologist, and I was like, well, if I'm going to be fair, I should represent Dan's response to their response. Mm-hmm. So I tried my best. But yes, you would see it as the Gadianton robbers, secret oath, secret combinations as a reflection of anti-Masonic rhetoric in Joseph's environment. And Andrew Jackson, he was running for president, or he had just become president during the dictation of the Book of Mormon, and all this fear of like the Masons overthrowing the government. I think you want to say about that I didn't cover.
Well, to me, it's woven into the message, and why the message is so important that the Book of Mormon is given out in Joseph Smith's Revelations, and the need for a city of refuge to escape the coming Holocaust and secret combinations. And that was one of the reasons Joseph Smith gave for leaving New York and moving to the Ohio, as it says, was to escape the coming wars and Holocaust that is going to destroy the wicked from off the face of the earth, and that there's a city of refuge. Without the Book of Mormon and the Revelations, where is our religion? We have none, because then we wouldn't know where to build the city of Zion. So that was they the urgency for Joseph Smith's message was felt largely because Jackson had been elected. So a lot of people, of course, he was elected, so he was popular enough to get elected. But there was a significant minority that were terribly upset and believed that the end was near, that the American experiment was over, that a secret combination, a Masonic king, that Jackson was from Tennessee, and he was a worshipful master and considered a king in the Masonic uh, organization. And so a king had risen, and not just a Masonic king. He was also the hero of the War of 1812 and a military chieftain type person. And a lot of people feared him because he was very decisive. He had
Right.
he was very decisive general in the War of 1812 and the war with the Indians over there in Florida. He was even known because he hung 4 men. One of them, I think, one of them was a minister, but for treason, without going through the proper channels.
Pretty
I mean,
ruthless,
like
man.
he was very decisive and scary that way. He was called Old Hickory because he was tough. He was tough and um a decisive general, and a lot of people feared that he would organize some insurrection or coup. And he was also implicated. The Masons themselves, anti-Masons, I mean, um, linked him with Aaron Burr's 1805 conspiracy. And the Aaron Burr was, of course, famous for um, dueling with Alexander Hamilton and killing Alexander Hamilton. But Aaron Burr, the vice president under Jefferson, he was believed to have started a coup to overthrow the government in the western territories of the United States, out there before it was Indian land, actually. But and that he actually used in his correspondence the Royal Arch cipher, secret, code language to convey orders and information in his group. And that Andrew Jackson was implicated in that coup, but it was never like proven or tried or anything. It was just a rumor, more or less, that he was involved with that overthrow attempt. And so he was a scary guy that got into office. Not everybody believed all those stories, of course. And they used to hand out these handbills called the coffin handbill, against Andrew Jackson, with these coffins of four or five men that he had hung, and accuse him of being a murderer. And the anti-Masonic part of the political propaganda is what it really was, and it was mostly effective in New York, especially Western New York, where William Morgan had been allegedly murdered by the Masons for attempting to publish in 1826 a expose of their secret ceremonies. It was eventually published the following year, posthumously, because what happened was that William Morgan was arrested and put in the Canandaigua jail. And that Canandaigua was about 10 or 11 miles south of Palmyra. And it was where the Smiths did a lot of their business, especially land transactions later. And as the story goes, the Masons came and took him out of the jail and there was a conspiracy with the jailers, and took him out of jail and whisked him off in a carriage and one night, and he was never heard of again. And the supposition was that he was murdered by the Masons. And then when Governor DeWitt Clinton tried to conduct an investigation and have the perpetrators tried, they all got off with light sentences, and so the accusation was that the Masons had infiltrated government. The judges were all Masons secretly. The jurors were Masons, and there was a conspiracy to circumvent law and order. And so all of this was in the air at the time the Book of Mormon appeared.
Right.
And it seemed to tap in and reflect this fear. Okay.
I know Martin Harris referred to the Book of Mormon as the Anti-Masonic Bible. I think you have an article named that. So
with that title,
they would have read that in the Book of Mormon.
Yes, the Geauga, Ohio Gazette published this statement of an interview with Martin Harris, who reportedly said the Book of Mormon is the anti-Masonic Bible, and those who do not believe it will be damned. So, and he was a big anti-Mason himself. And the country kind of divided along the lines of, if you were anti-Mason, you were against Jackson. So they would call, like, Grandin, who put Albert Grandin's press that published and printed the Book of Mormon, they called him an anti-Masonic press, or a Jackson press, actually, a pro-Masonic press, because he was pro-Jackson, so he was a pro-Mason. And then, but Joseph Smith first went to an anti-Masonic press to have the Book of Mormon published by Thurlow Weed. And when Grandin first was approached, he said no. Okay, he didn't want anything to do with it. He didn't think it would. He didn't think it would sell. And that's why he wanted Martin Harris to put up the money first, guarantee the money. Then he went with it. But when Grandin said no, they went to Rochester and approached Thurlow Weed, who was the biggest anti-Mason in the United States, probably, and publishing from the Anti-Masonic Inquirer in Rochester, New York, all these anti-Jackson, articles. So he was trying to combat Jackson's election, but and it did hurt his campaign in Western New York, but not over the whole United States. So Jackson got into office, and a lot of people thought, well, that's it, we're done. And so my argument is that the Gadianton robbers are an exaggerated version of what the Masons could become. They weren't that way in the United States at the time.
Right.
But everybody has in anticipation what would happen. And the Book of Mormon has a lot of the secret combinations show up in an election and intrigue where the king is assassinated secretly in order to get somebody in Gadianton's band on the throne. And so the history of the Book of Mormon ebbs and flows with these secret combinations. And when they're righteous and they have, God helps them, and they can keep the Gadianton robbers at bay in the wilderness, right? So it starts as an infiltration of the government, and then when they're discovered through the help of the prophets, like Nephi, not the first but the second, they are able to uncover the perpetrators, and they are captured, and then they push the secret combinations into the wilderness, and then they become robbers because they're pushed into the wilderness. Okay.
Right.
So but they want to infiltrate government, and for money, power and money, and so it's the ebb and flow, of Nephite civilization that gets proud, and then the Indians and the Gadianton robbers start causing problems, and then they repent, and they're able to, with God's help and the prophets, by listening to the prophets, are able to restore a more pure theocratic type government. So so that's one aspect of the secret combinations in the Book of Mormon, and it stands as a Jeremiah that was preached from the pulpits, similar kinds of things. And then there's an actual warning of latter-day secret combinations that more or less says, in the last days, when the book comes forth, there will be secret combinations. And Moroni talks about it after he talks about the Jaredites being destroyed by secret combinations. Then he takes that opportunity to warn America of the secret combination in the singular. This is the only time it goes singular. The secret combination shall be among you. When you see these things come among you, take this as a warning, repent. He also talks about when the nation that ceases to recognize Jesus as the God of this land, right? Then they shall be swept off. And that's Jackson, and Masonry was seen as a substitute, a corruption of Christianity. It believed that you had to believe in God, okay, to be a Mason. And they used the Bible, but they corrupted the stories in the Bible with these fake stories, they made their own stories up and put them in their ceremonies, and they were fake stories, and it was a fake substitute religion, and it was really run by the devil. And the anti-Masons, part of their propaganda was that Satan inspired in Gadianton in his heart to organize the secret combination, which led to the destruction of the Nephites. And the Jaredites also were destroyed through secret combinations. And America, if you don't watch out, you're going to be destroyed by secret combinations. And when you see this secret combination among you, more or less repent.
And you're saying that Masonry was the secret combination. It was referred to as secret combination.
Yes. To me, it makes perfect sense to the first readers.
Yeah.
Okay. And at the very least, if you don't want to believe that Joe Smith is inspired to write this kind of story, whether he was inspired or not is not a scholarly pursuit. It's
right. There's no way you can determine that.
Right. I can't. So, but if there's people who believe it, and there are more and more scholars who are coming around to this view, I believe.
Yeah.
And
as I did the video on it, I kind of thought okay, if this is a 19th century text, I was like, I think Dan's on the money. I was like, this is a good argument for.
But at the very least, this is how they saw it.
Yeah, at the very least, yeah, no doubt about it.
At the very least, this is how they're reading it. So whether you want to believe it's historical or not is really a secondary issue to this receptus, textus recepticus kind of thing. This is how it was received. This is how they viewed it. This is why it made sense to them. This is why they saw it as so urgent, why they wanted to follow some guy into the wilderness and build a Zion, to escape all of this.
Right.
But it eventually passes. This crisis of, the end of the world didn't come. Jackson wasn't the last president like Martin Harris was prophesying. Okay. He was prophesying Jackson would be our last president. Jackson went through 2 terms, and he was out of office by the time they got to Nauvoo. And you don't hear this anti-Masonic rhetoric. You don't hear secret combinations being discussed. It's mentioned in early revelations as the reason for leaving New York, but you don't hear it discussed anymore by the time they get to Nauvoo.
Right. Okay, so
I'm not
there's
sure how they were dealing with it, but it does creep up when the temple endowment is revealed. Some Mormons think, well, that's a secret combination. Why are we doing that?
okay. So I want to bring up two brief apologetics. I think I outlined both
Okay.
videos, so maybe if you watched it, you might know what I'm going to bring up. First one is to say, why did Joe Smith go from writing a book that's anti-Masonic? I believe weren't his brother Hiram and was his father a Mason, or was it just Hiram? I can't remember. I know his Hiram.
Well, we know for sure it's Hiram because he transferred his records from Palmyra to Nauvoo. So we're pretty sure. We're not sure if the one record that we have of that lodge is our Hiram. It probably is, but there was another Hiram in the area. But I kind of ruled him out. That it's most likely is our Hiram being mentioned, and he isn't listed among the people that the members that were being initiated that year. So the idea is that he was eligible to become a Mason in 1823, and some people try to use that date, but we're not sure he joined in 1823, but we know he joined before 1827.
Okay. Right. Okay. So one apologetic is to say why it seems strange. Why would Joseph write a book that's very anti-Masonic with his brother being a Mason? Maybe others, but according to documents, most likely just his brother that we know of. And then him later, like 12, 13 years later, joining the Masons. That's such a big switcheroo. What would you say to that? I think I remember you said in your video, Joe Smith is entitled to change his views and change his mind maybe on the Mason, so it's not.
It wouldn't be the only time he changed his mind about things. He developed his doctrine of the Godhead and other subjects over time. But listen, in Nauvoo, when he joined the Masons, he was also saying at the same time that his endowment was a restoration of their corrupt version.
That's right.
Okay, that they had apostatized from the true priesthood. And that's not different than the Book of Mormon, if you look at it that way. That he isn't embracing Masonry without qualification. He says they're apostate, and
he's restoring parts which have been corrupted. Yeah. Right, I see.
So when people say, well, how could he be anti and then join? Well, he joined, and he probably had good reasons for joining. But like I said, by the time Nauvoo comes around, the end of the world hadn't happened. The big Mason takeover of the United States didn't happen. He might have been changing his views from being so radical, in the Book of Mormon, to being more tempered as an adult, in Nauvoo. And he saw practical reasons for joining, and I believe one of them was protection. If you join the Masons, then you all of a sudden have all these people that are bound by oath to protect and defend you.
Yeah, it's quite a brotherhood.
It would be a smart move on Joseph Smith's part to do this, and so he has that protection. He even tried to use that protection to protect himself at the time he was murdered. So,
right.
But it didn't work. They declared him an apostate. So they didn't have to follow the oath.
Right. And the other apologetic is that the term secret combinations, while it could be used to refer to the Masons, apologists would argue that it's not exclusive to Freemasonry, and that other, secret society and
Mm-hmm.
conspiracy groups trying to overthrow the government. Throughout, history could be referred to secret combinations, and that it could be a reference like mafia organizations or things. And they would also say that there's maybe some dissimilarities between the Gadiantans and the Masons.
Well,
So what would be, that's
yeah.
kind of like two questions. What would be your response? I think you do address that in your video. What's your response to that?
Well, there is a certain interpretation that wants to make the Book of Mormon pro-Mason because they want to see Joe Smith as pro-Mason his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
New book that's out that talks about this interpretation, which I disagree with.
I don't know
The
in this
one
if they're
thing,
necessarily trying to make him pro-Mason, but they're probably trying to argue that anti-Masonry isn't exclusively the only secret, secret combination doesn't only exclusively refer to Masonry. I think they're trying to argue that maybe other, ancient secret societies, conspiring groups trying to overthrow the government could also be referred to as secret combinations. So it's not
yes,
necessary.
that's the apologists
That's the
talk
apologists.
about that.
That's the
And
argument.
yes, I mean, who can argue against that in a way? But there's a new book, Method Infinite. You may have heard it. And the authors try to say that Joe Smith was predestined to restore Masonry to its pure form. And he was this big pro-Mason all along. And they try to make the Book of Mormon pro-Masonic. But the only problem is that,
That's interesting.
yeah, the only problem is that the thing that, the identifying feature of the Gadianton robbers is the secret signs and secret words.
Yes.
And it doesn't distinguish between true secret signs and Satan inspired secret signs. It's the secret signs and secret words, and that God does not work in darkness, right? In the Book of Mormon is against secrecy like that altogether. God works in the open, and Satan works in the dark and in secrecy and secret murders and secret combinations to gain power and money. And so Masons have secret signs and secret words, and the Book of Mormon does not exclude Masons. It has that one identifying feature that is trying to identify this group over any other kind of robbers, and so I would say that when the Book of Mormon predicts that this secret combination shall get above you, it's talking about people who have secret signs and secret words. That's in America at the time.
Mm.
And all the readers who ever dared to comment on the Book of Mormon's contents or even dare to read it, most of them didn't even read it. So the ones that read it and commented on it all identified the secret combinations with the Masons. No exception. Mormon, non-Mormon, it didn't matter. They all identified the Book of Mormon with Freemasonry. So how can you warn people if they didn't know what you were talking about? And so I believe the first readers are probably right. That's what the author intended by this warning, and it makes sense. There is nobody else to identify. Now, it's true that in all societies there are secret combinations, or secret groups.
Yeah.
Some of them even have different secret signs, in various
So I
different
think the apologists
cultures.
are arguing if there was a ancient Nephites,
Right.
historical Book of Mormon, maybe they could have secret societies and
Oh yeah.
with
So the Gadianton robbers are not Masons. I'm not saying that they are Masons in the ancient times. They were ancients. No, they're analogous. The Book of Mormon is making an analogy from the destruction that occurred in their society to warn the latter days of their problem. Okay,
Right.
that is similar, that they use these secret signs to be a subculture and infiltrate government. It's somebody infiltrating government at the time the book appears. Okay, that's what Mormon says. They will be. I know that they're there when this book comes forth. So who is there? Who's there in America, okay, that has secret words and secret signs that is trying to infiltrate government?
So you would say the Masons were
I mean,
the main secret combination when the Book of Mormon
that,
came?
it's them, you know. I mean, Nephi says he likes plainness so that the readers will know what he's talking about. And so if they got it wrong, then how plain was it? You know, it's only became wrong, you know, when the prophecy didn't come to pass, when the end of the world didn't come to pass, when Zion wasn't built. You know, Joseph Smith didn't succeed in building Zion. He failed. Those prophecies failed as well, not just the Book of Mormon prophecy about secret combinations. So, and
Unless
then
be later fulfilled.
that's what my book is about um, charisma under pressure. What do you do when the prophecies fell, when you don't build the Zion?
When
How do
persecution.
you overcome?
Yeah, people challenging your authority.
Yeah, how do you overcome the failure of charisma, or how charisma has to develop in order to survive failure? They went to redeem Zion through force, through the Zion's camp. It failed. How do you overcome? And he was withstood to the face when he got back to Kirtland. You know, he had to overcome all these things. How did he do it? And they're very predictable. And I draw on Max Weber's. Max Weber was at the turn of the last century, a sociologist who wrote on from charisma to institution. He, like early Christianity, started out as a very charismatic group of believers, and they experienced failure of prophecy. Everyone in that generation died before Jesus returned, and that was the prediction, you know, that Jesus would return before everyone in that generation died. And how did they overcome that? And they made they had excuses too. And it's written right there in the Bible. There are excuses for why John the Revelator died before Jesus returned, you know. So they were very aware of the failure of prophecy, and they prepared for the long haul, and that was, well, to project outward. It's all about converting the world now, you know. That's our job, you know. And they started reading scripture a little differently. Oh, we have all these other things to fulfill before that happens anyway. We just didn't see that part. And so they start building an institution, a hierarchy, and that actually survives longer than the founders. So, and that's what my book is about how does Joseph Smith, the charisma under pressure, how does he respond to all these pressures from his own followers, not just persecutors from the outside? And how does he keep it together? And Max Weber predicted that you would build an institution that would, that the authority of charisma would shift to the authority of office. So now the charisma comes out of being president of the church.
Your authority.
It's like the Pope. I mean, he's just some priest, you know, in South America somewhere, and they make him Pope, and all of a sudden he has all this charisma, you know, and people like are falling all over themselves, and thousands of people meeting to hear every word he said, and before that, it cared less, you know. So it's a charisma of office, and then the institution, he shares charisma with others in the institution, and the institution becomes self-preserving. You know, no one person is more important than the institution, and they'll cut you off in a heartbeat, you know, in order to save the institution, because it's more important than any one individual or any idea. Okay, so
okay,
that's what my book's is about.
That's what your book's about. Okay, well, for people to go get your book, we've been going a long time, but in wrapping up, is there any other? So we talked about main sources you see or influences for the Book of Mormon, Mound Builder myth, King James Bible, Methodist, Protestant revivals, conversion experiences, and Masonry. Anti-Masonic rhetoric.
Mhm.
I think in your book you talk about maybe some like autobiographical, things maybe with his family.
Yeah.
Is there any other main sort of influences you see for inspiration for Joseph, or that he's drawing upon? Like any main ones?
No, I think we covered
Kind of
just
covered it.
about anything. There might be. I just can't think
A
of
little
them.
small.
Uh, but as I was saying, um, some people can still see all of this as being inspired
Yeah.
and needed at the time. It got the job done. It was a maybe they might see it as a miracle. See, like uh, Brian Hale's approach is to show how difficult it would be to do it naturally. Okay,
Yes. And I want to
and
talk about that in part two with you.
yeah,
Get your
and
take.
my basic position is that okay, I don't have a problem with you seeing it as a revelation. Okay, he wants to bracket historicity. I want to bracket inspiration. Okay,
I see you're
so
sort of saying that from a scholarly sort of sense, I cannot determine if it's
right.
inspired or not. Like, because I remember I had a conversation with Anthony Miller, who's not a believer. He doesn't believe Book of Mormon is historical, and he actually, I thought, had a respectable sort of theory for Book of Mormon composition. So we did an interview, and he sort of said, like, I'm kind of open because he's still open to the divine. He's not full
Mhm.
on atheist like or naturalist like you, Dan. He's still open, and he says, I'm open to the possibility of maybe the divine playing a role in it. And he's sort of like, but I can't. It's kind of like one of those things where like you can't really prove it one way or the other.
It's subjective. And
Yes.
Hales is trying to get scholars to make a judgment that scholarship can't make. If he wants to see it as, oh, beyond Joseph Smith's ability, that there's something in there that Joseph Smith just could not do. He couldn't do all this. He couldn't keep all this straight. Uh, whatever he wants to do, that's he can't say Joseph Smith couldn't have written the Book of Mormon. That's my view. He can't say that. He might believe that it's beyond just Smith's ability. We know it's beyond maybe mine because I'm just in a whole nother genre altogether. So I can't write. An educated person could not have written a Book of Mormon in the first place. It just not there. Okay. Um, so if he wants to see that personally, that it's his subjective judgment that Joseph Smith could not have written that, that's okay with me. Okay,
Okay.
I have no problem with you thinking that it's a revelation, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking that. Okay, for me, I don't. My subjective judgment is that he could have written it. Okay, and I give all these my reasons. Okay, um, and some people might see the truth is in between that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's their subjective judgment. But to
Sure.
try
But
to
we all for it.
force people into believing the Book of Mormon could not have been written by Joseph Smith, therefore there's no naturalist explanation for it, and you have to believe it's inspired, or I'm going to force you to do it and twist your arm behind your intellectual back. You know what I mean? That is what I have a problem with.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I wouldn't agree with that either.
That is what an evangelical or say a proselytizing apologist would try to do. That's kind of their job description.
Right.
So so that's what he's doing, and if he wants to be seen as a legitimate scholar, you know, you can't do that. You can't oppose as a legitimate scholar and then use that method. You know, it doesn't work.
Okay. Well, I think part one we've had a really good long discussion on sort of I think we've laid out quite thoroughly sort of like your view of motivations for why Joseph would have created the Book of Mormon, your thoughts
Mhm.
on the mechanics of how he was doing it, the process, studying it out in his mind, and he had an outline probably in his head and it was semi-extemporaneous. And then we talked about some of the main sources or influences you see for the Book of Mormon. Unless you have any final thoughts you want to give, adding on, this could be a good place to start for part one, and then
Yeah, okay.
part two, maybe put you more not on the hot seat, but a little bit more in the defense. I tend to do that with a lot of
I
my.
haven't been already.
No, no, this is me being nice.
Ooh.
Because with
Better
most
go eat my Wheaties.
scholars I interview, and I don't grill people, but I tend to let them. I want you to tell me, for example, evidence to support the Book of Mormon, and then I want to sort of ask them some tough questions on
whatever.
Yeah, so I thought that could be good in part two to bring up with you maybe some of the apologetic arguments or evidence they would point to, not in a way where I'm going to try to trip you up or force you that you must believe, but just to get your general response. And again, you said you're going to dive deeper into it, so your views may change, and who knows, maybe you'll convert to the other side. We'll see what happens. But come back for part two. If you enjoyed this one, everyone, like, share, and subscribe. Go check out his YouTube channel and his book, Drew Smith, Making of a Prophet, if you want to read more about his theory for the Book of Mormon, and also his latest book, Charisma Under Pressure, as well. I'll put links in the description where they can get it, and come back for part two. You don't want to miss it. Take care. Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.